Hi, my name is Justin from Normal.
My name is Maritza Perez from the Drug Policy Alliance.
My name is Alan Robinson with Wisconsin Normal.
My name is Mitchell Gomez.
My name is Amber Littlejohn from the Minority Cannabis Business Association.
And we'd like to welcome you to
States as we discuss the future of cannabis policy reform.
We'll be talking about topics that impact people.
Live Q&A sessions.
We hope that you will tune in.
Vote November.
David Culver, Vice President of Government and Policy Seminar, for the opportunity to support such a significant event. At Canopy Growth Corporation, we pride ourselves on such like-minded organizations, including Normal, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, Drug Policy Alliance, and Minority Cannabis Business Association. We are truly at an inflection point where there's increasing momentum and national conversation around cannabis legalization and social justice. This dialogue only fuels the continuing efforts on cannabis reform, including federal legalization, decriminalization, expungement of records, and elevating communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. Each and every one of us has an opportunity to turn conversation into action. I'd like to personally thank our special guests, Senator Ron Wyden and Representatives Barbara Lee, Earl Blumenauer, and Hakeem Jeffries for their pivotal roles in this important discussion surrounding the evolving drug policy landscape and the future of cannabis in America. The table is set to end the prohibition of cannabis thanks to your hard work, and Canopy Growth is excited and committed to work with each of you to create the future of legalized cannabis. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.
Thank you so very much for tuning in to the National Drug Policy Reform Seminar. My name is Justin Streckel, and I'm the Political Director for Normal. And it is my great privilege to get to introduce Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, the sitting Democratic Caucus Chairman of the House Majority Caucus in the House of Representatives. As one of the most powerful and influential figures in the House of Representatives, Congressman Jeffries has been instrumental in helping us get to this place where we are very close to achieving the first ever full vote to end marijuana prohibition and criminalization nationwide. So with that said, I turn it over to Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, Chair of the House Democratic Caucus. It's an honor to join this National Drug Policy Reform Seminar, and I'm so thankful for the tremendous advocacy and leadership of Normal in effecting and advocating for drug policy reform year after year, decade after decade. The war on drugs has been a spectacular failure. When Richard Nixon first announced the war on drugs in 1971, there were less than 350,000 people incarcerated in America. Today, there are 2.2 million, disproportionately Black and Latino. And a significant number of those individuals who have been incarcerated are there for non-violent drug offenses, including for simple possession of small quantities of marijuana. That is a disgrace. The war on drugs has devastated individuals, devastated families, and devastated communities, particularly of color. Marijuana prohibition, in particular, has a sordid history on the question of race. We know that this policy was racist in its origination, targeting Negroes, Latinos, Filipinos, and musicians, and alleging that the use of marijuana was creating antisocial behavior. At a moment like this in America, where we are dealing with systemic racism, it is particularly appropriate that we would end the federal prohibition on marijuana once and for all, and bury this wrong-headed policy with its racist origins in the ground, never to be seen again. That is why I strongly support passage of the MORE Act. I'm thankful for the leadership of Chairman Jerry Nadler, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and all of my colleagues within the House Democratic Caucus, and those in the United States Senate, such as Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who recognize that the time has come for a progressive, visionary, forward-looking drug policy, beginning with changing our marijuana laws. It's also important to make sure that in those communities that have been particularly impacted and hurt by the failed war on drugs and the disproportionate impact of marijuana enforcement on young men and women of color, are able to benefit from restorative justice. And that if we create entrepreneurial opportunities in places like New York with the legalization of marijuana, that every single community, regardless of zip code, regardless of race, regardless of religion, regardless of region, can benefit from this change in the law. We also have to make sure that we expunge the records of those individuals who were prosecuted for marijuana possession over the years, denying them access to equal opportunity for jobs or housing or education in ways that have set them back. The time has come for meaningful and transformative change. And that is why I'm so thankful for the advocacy, the leadership, the efforts, the hard work of Normal, and all of you who are in attendance at this seminar. We're close to the finish line, and now is not the time for us to let up. Our country still mourns the passing of the legendary John Lewis, the congressman extraordinaire and the civil rights hero, who I had the privilege of serving with for 7.5 years. John Lewis would say to us in a moment like this, when you see something wrong, find a way to get in the way. Keep the faith, keep your eyes on the prize, never give up, never give in, and find a way to get into some good trouble. Well, as it relates to marijuana policy, this policy dripping in racist origins that has disproportionately impacted low-income people of every race and communities of color, it's time to end the federal prohibition. It's time for the MORE Act. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your advocacy. God bless you. God bless Normal. God bless the United States of America.
Hi, my name is Maritza Perez with the Drug Policy Alliance. Today I'll be sitting down with Gina Clayton Johnson of the Movement for Black Lives, Eunices Hernandez of La Defensa, and Mitchell Gomez of Dance Safe to discuss the history of the war on drugs and the case for drug decriminalization. This issue is important because drug arrests and convictions continue to drive people into the criminal legal system without providing adequate treatment for those who need it. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and please stay tuned for the live Q&A.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Maritza Perez, National Affairs Director of the Drug Policy Alliance. The panel I'm moderating today will discuss the racist origins of the war on drugs and make the case for drug decriminalization. In 2018, there were more than 1.6 million drug arrests in the US. More than 86% of these arrests were for possession alone, and many more are for minor selling and distribution violations. Moreover, people of color continue to bear the brunt of this country's drug enforcement laws. The war on drugs has devastated the lives of countless individuals and families. And in addition to adding to our system of mass incarceration, drug convictions can have life-altering consequences in the lives of individuals, affecting a person's ability to earn a wage, go to school, keep a roof over their heads, and perform civic duties that you and I may take for granted, like voting. On today's panel, we're going to lay out why drug decriminalization is necessary and explain how to do it in a way that is just. We will show how drug decriminalization is a racial justice issue, and we will give insight into a future world where drugs are decriminalized in the US and the health and bodily autonomy of individuals are prioritized. Let's welcome our panelists. We have a great panel for you today, including individuals that I've had the pleasure to know and work with for a number of years now. So, I'll just let you guys go ahead and introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your organizations. People who are viewing this might not be familiar with everybody. So let's start with you, Mitchell.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Mitchell Gomez. I'm the executive director of DanceSafe. DanceSafe is a health education and harm reduction nonprofit. We work primarily in the electronic music communities. And we do a lot of things. We do a lot of things around drug education, consent, a whole sort of host of harm reduction services. But the thing that we're really sort of most known for is being the first organization in the US that brought on-site drug checking services to events. So we set up at events, people bring us their substances, we chemically analyze them, and then provide appropriate health education, even if it is the substance they expect it is, right? Because even if your cocaine is cocaine, there's still things that you should know about cocaine use, right? So, but yeah, in addition to all of that, one of the things that we are constantly out there trying to push is the information that people need to understand the origins of the problems with the drug supply. So people often think of the fentanyl crisis as a drug crisis, when in reality, it's a drug prohibition crisis, right? The reason that fentanyl ends up in all of these other substances, the reason that it ends up in things that are being sold as heroin, as well as things that are being sold as cocaine, methamphetamine, MDMA, is not anything intrinsic to the drug markets. It's because drugs are illegal. And so the drug war itself is actually the origin of most of the problems that DanceSafe is trying to address. And so we think it's really important to always be out there pushing that messaging that the drug war itself is the thing causing what people think of as these, drug problems.
Great, thank you. Gina, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Gina Clayton Johnson. I am on the policy table leadership for the Movement for Black Lives. The Movement for Black Lives is an ecosystem of over 150 Black-led, Black-centered groups that are in the streets, in the courthouses, in the community centers, in the outside governors' mansions, state houses, et cetera, fighting to defend and protect Black life day in and day out. I also run an organization called SE Justice Group. We are a California-based organization of women with incarcerated loved ones fighting for an end to mass incarceration and all the harms that it has caused, particularly Black and brown women and gender nonconforming folks. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Eunices, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Maritza and everyone. My name is Eunices Hernandez. I'm the co-executive director of a C4 nonprofit called La Defensa that's based in LA. We work on judges accountability, judges campaigns, and also the implementation and development of alternatives to incarceration and pretrial reform. La Defensa and myself were also members of a coalition called the Justice LA Coalition. And the Justice LA Coalition, the main goal was to stop jail expansion in LA County and implement, a system of care and support that we all would like to see so our communities can thrive. And so we've been successful in stopping LA County's $3.5 billion jail plan. And now we're implementing alternatives to incarceration, so people stop getting incarcerated for the offenses and the things that we're going to be talking about today.
Great, thank you. Well, to start us off, I think it would be great for our viewers just to have a better sense of how we got to the place that we're at today. To give a real history of the war on drugs, because I think what a lot of people don't realize is that this war was actually literally started on the backs of people of color. Like much of our policy, if you look at much of U.S. policy, when you find out its origins, you find a lot of it is race-based. Eunices, can you explain to our viewers a little bit about the history of the war on drugs, its origins, and how we got to where we are today?
Sure. Thank you, Maritza. So the war on drugs really began, decades ago, and the policies that were born out of it were really to control different populations. So, for example, when we saw marijuana became illegal, it was because it was associated with Mexican immigrants who at the time were working in California on different things, such as the railroads and the construction of, cities. And so marijuana became illegal and it was associated with the Latino community. But also the policies that come out of the war on drugs were really created to hold other communities down as well. So when we see, for example, the epidemic around crack use, you know, if you had 1 gram of crack and 1 gram of coke, like the punishment before Obama became president and changed the rules was 100 to 1. And it was really because it was associated with Black communities, Black families. And you can go all the way back to every single policy that made drugs illegal, drug possession illegal. And you can always trace it back to racist origins. Like there's no beating around the bush on this. The policies that were born out of the war on drugs are racist policies born to control our communities, our most vulnerable communities and communities of color. And so there's just so many other details we can get into the past. But I think the most important piece for us to remember is that these are policies based on racism meant to control communities and put them in incarceration.
Absolutely. And we still see disproportionate enforcement rates, right? Like even if we look at something like marijuana possession, we know that Black and white populations use marijuana and other drugs at similar rates, but Black folks are 4 times more likely to be arrested for drug use and possession. So we see that not just in enforcement, but we see that in our system of mass incarceration. So Gina, I'm going to turn to you now, and I know you're very familiar with how expansive like the system is. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of drug convictions? Not just, I think people like often think about drug convictions affecting, the criminal system, the criminal legal system, or they think about it in that context. But we know that it's actually much more expansive than that. How can a drug conviction or interaction with the criminal legal system affect a person's life outside of just the justice system?
Absolutely. And thank you for that question. And I just want to also really uplift what Eunices just spoke to, which is that, we are here and must, I think, as advocates and as responsible holders of accurate history, reject the idea that the war on drugs was designed to address a health epidemic. It was not. The war on drugs, it was a project, an anti-Black political project. And we know that both not just by seeing how successful it was in completely destabilizing and debilitating our political power, our wealth, our connectedness to family members, but it's also straight from, we have quotes from the Nixon administration, right? Like, and I just want to, I hope that multiple times during the DPA summit and convening that we're all having online right now, that we hear and repeat what we know. And I'm just going to say, that what John Ehrlichman says when he says the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and Black people, is something that we need to understand. This is what those policies were designed to do, was to attack the left and to attack Black people. And so they took it upon themselves to make it illegal, essentially, to be Black, right? And so the way in which war on drugs policies have worked through our lives has been manifold. I'll just give one example. At SE Justice Group, we are an organization of women and GNC folks who have loved ones behind bars. And one of our members, one of our most brilliant member leaders, is a woman who spent several years incarcerated in a state next to ours in California. She was incarcerated as a result of her drug addiction. And she became addicted when, after suffering the loss of her child and having absolutely no support, no services, and entering into a complete and total depression. Her neighbors were so concerned, her friends, her family were concerned, but it was one neighbor that came over one day and said, "This will make you feel better." And she became hooked on crack cocaine for years after that, never received any help.
Connections.
Finally, was put into that jail cell, and because of her incarceration, lost custody to her 2 sons. Years later, now this was in the 90s, right? This was at the height of kind of the drug war and the enforcement of these policies, which continue today, right? We know that they're still happening.
So you got your...
But when she gets out, she begins to
Trying to
fight
figure
for
out.
her children to come back and live with her. She receives full custody, where she gets full custody back to both of her children, but they at that point have suffered irreparable trauma, and her decades-long fight begins at that point for mental health care services for both of them. Today, she believes that she probably will never ever be able to visit her son, who's incarcerated now outside of a cell because of the length of his sentence. So we know that the impact of the war on drugs was one that looks like a complete and total divestment from the things that we know keep people well, healthy, and safe, from services she should have gotten. Trauma services. She should have gotten mental health care services for her children. She should have gotten all kinds of harm reduction, all kinds of approaches, things that we know work. She got none of that. We have nothing in our communities because of the extreme amount of money that it takes to operate the punitive mechanisms of war on drugs policies, and it has caused massive amounts of trauma, as well as destruction of families and death, and the impact on Black women. Mass incarceration is, of course, we know millions and millions of people behind bars with criminal records, barred from employment, from housing, etc. Today, I'll just end with this stat: 1 in 2 Black women has a family member in prison today. 1 in 2. So this impact that has been the impact of the war on drugs has been a project of political and inhumane destruction of our people. And we know that right now, in this moment of uprising, is when we have I think this incredibly strong political opportunity to roll back on those policies and make some real change.
Thank you for that, Gina. So Mitchell, I know your organization rejects punitive approaches to drug policy. And Gina mentioned this a little, but can you talk to us about what harm reduction is and what that approach is like?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the crux of harm reduction is simply in accepting that certain people are going to use substances and trying to figure out how we can mitigate the risks of that substance use, right? So what Gina was saying about the sort of generational trauma, if you look at the number one predictor of a person developing problematic substance use behaviors, the number one predictor is childhood trauma, right? So I think it's important that we recognize that the war on drugs is literally a war on childhood trauma victims. Like, that's bottom line what it is, top to bottom, particularly people of color. And then when you create generational trauma through the drug war itself, you've sort of set up a dynamic that allows you to use the drug war to continually re-victimize these same communities over and over and over and over again. Right? People, particularly politicians on the right, often talk about like broken Black families, as if the brokenness wasn't imposed upon those communities by government policy, right? These families weren't broken internally, they were broken. They were broken from the outside. And so, yeah, but harm reduction is really meeting substance users where they're at, recognizing that certain people are going to use drugs and that there's ways to mitigate the risks of those drugs. So from a purely practical standpoint, a lot of times what this looks like, particularly in the early years, was needle exchanges, right? Where people could come and get clean rigs, and so that we could slow the spread of HIV and other bloodborne illnesses. But these services also act as a window that allow us to talk to substance users in a way that they actually hear what you're saying. We are lied to so often in America about drugs that often honest drug education is impossible because people have been propagandized from the time they were 3 years old, right? The smashed egg in a pan. And, if you look at the history of drug war commercials, they've never been shown to reduce rates of drug use, right? No matter how much money we spend on commercials, and it's a lot of money. I mean, we're talking about millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. They don't change drug use behavior, but what those commercials by the DEA do is frame the drug use conversation, right? Drugs will scramble your brain, drugs will make you sit on the couch and sink it, and they're often such nonsense. I mean, I was like maybe 12 or 13 when I first had a DARE class and realized just what even at that point, I had primitive internet and just immediately realized what complete nonsense it was. And so the really useful thing about harm reduction is that it allows you to talk to substance users in a way that you wouldn't otherwise. And drug checking, which is sort of one of the main DanceSafe services, is actually really useful in that regard because it allows us to talk to non-problematic, non-IV or IM drug users. Right? So the vast majority of substance users don't ever develop any of the diagnostic criteria for problematic substance use disorder, what used to be called addiction. Even of the drugs that people think of as really addictive, the majority of people who use them do not develop those patterns of behavior. So the DEA says that 24 to 26% of opioid users develop problematic substance use disorder, right? So 3/4 of opiate users are what we would call recreational users, but we don't see them, we don't talk to them, they're not sort of in the debate because even people who are very open about their substance use often won't talk about their opioid use. So by doing on-site drug checking services, we get a chance to talk to that massive body of non-problematic substance users, educate them about how to be healthier in their choices. But I mean, everyone understands harm reduction immediately when you compare it to seatbelts and floaties, right? Nobody thinks that seatbelts encourage speeding. You never hear, oh, we should ban seatbelts because if we do that, people will drive really carefully. But you hear that about the needle exchanges, right? Oh, if you just ban needle exchanges, if you just make needles more difficult to get, if you make them illegal, people will stop, using IV drugs. And that's just not how human behavior works. That's not how any of this works. The other one small thing I wanted to say about the history of the drug war, if I could, is that it's really interesting to me from an international context. If you look way, way back, I tried to find the first drug law at one point. I wanted to know who was the first person who said, this should not be legal. And I found a lot of contextualized drug laws that said, oh, this drug can only be done by these people, this drug can only be done in these places. But the first general ban on any drug that I could find historically was an edict by the Spanish Inquisition in the 1620s, banning peyote and mushroom use in the New World among the Nahua, subjects they had just conquered. So the Aztec, Mixtec, those empires that they just conquered. So as far as I can tell, the drug war as a purely prohibitionist policy was literally started by the Spanish Inquisition. And I think that's both an interesting and sort of really revealing underlying dynamic to that mindset of where the drug war is and where it came from.
That's super interesting.
I have a bunch of Nahua mushroom pieces up behind me. These are all original Aztec and Western shaft tomb culture mushroom pieces that I keep to remind me that substance use is an intrinsic part of the human condition, right? Every society that's had access to drugs has had people that use drugs. The only truly drug-free societies have been those within the Arctic Circle where no drugs grow. And so they were drug-free by the default status of there not being any drugs in their environment. But any culture where there's access to things that will alter your consciousness, humans really seem drawn to altering their consciousness. Nobody teaches little kids to spin around until they get dizzy. Right? Little kids just figure that out on their own, that if they do X, their consciousness changes. If they do, this thing, their consciousness changes. And they seem really drawn to that, just as part of who we are as a species. And so I just view the drug war as a violation of our fundamental human rights. I think that humans have a right to alter their consciousness. Humans have a right to explore their consciousness. And to me, this is fundamentally a civil rights issue. Either we own our bodies and our minds, or the government owns our bodies and our minds. And I simply refuse to accept that the government owns my mind.
Thank you, Mitchell. Melanie says, can you talk to us a little bit about what you're currently working on? I know Los Angeles always has all sorts of really leading activity. I know advocates like myself often look to Los Angeles as a leader when it comes to social justice movements. Are there any specific policy changes that you want to share related to dismantling the drug war?
Sure. So just to give a little bit of background, LA County has the largest jail system in the world and population, in the country. And so before COVID, we were at 17,000 people average every day. Most of those folks were there for offenses related to drug possession, sales, and even usage. And so we have in LA County for a long time relied on the jail system to deal with folks who are using substances instead of having a care system to support them, to make sure that one, they can use the drugs in a healthy way, but also get support if they're having problematic issues with their substance use. And so right now we've been working on this report called the Care First, Jails Last report, although we are Care First, not jails ever from our perspective. And so this Care First, Jail Last report, it was done in collaboration with LA County. And it includes over 115 recommendations on what we can build instead of jails, right? And so because we knew that the population in LA County jail was mostly people who had either behavioral health needs, such as mental health needs or substance use needs, we really wanted to push to create a system of prevention and support. And so this is the care system that we're talking about. And so in order for us to be able to decarcerate the jail population, we invested our time in this report. And some of the things that are included are create and expand the use of safe consumption spaces. Excuse me. So there's actually places where people can go and use their drugs safely and get access to services. Literally, maybe 3 blocks away from my house, someone OD'd and died in a Starbucks bathroom. And so that's the kind of things that we're seeing. And so, yes, we want to expand safe consumption spaces and create them here. We want to push the county, and it's included in the county report, which is incredible, for them to push for legislation to decriminalize drug possession and drug use. And so for us, that's the biggest thing. Like if we want to decarcerate and we want to help people in our communities, we need to build out this alternate system of care. For decades, millions and billions of dollars have been invested in creating this carceral system to deal with the war on drugs, to implement the war on drugs, to enforce it. And so we're at a moment where, yes, it's time to defund the police so that we can actually invest in the alternate systems that'll support our communities. And we're not talking about, replacing a carceral system with a punitive health system. No, we want to push for the creation of an accessible healthcare system where people can go voluntarily for services. And so that's what really we're targeting. The war on drugs on our end is actually helping create an alternate system of support. We've already worked on like repealing sentence enhancements, for example, for prior drug convictions. In California, if you had a prior drug conviction and you got a new one, they would add an additional 3 years to your sentence for each prior drug conviction. So and we know people who have problematic substance use are often criminalized over and over again. And so they go to jail many, many times in this endless cycle, catching convictions, right? Well, before 2018, every single prior drug conviction was an additional 3 years. We were seeing people in our LA County jails and in the county jails across the state serving over 12 years because they had an additional 4 drug cases, right? And these are county jails. There's no outside. For many places, there's no family touch visitation. It's all on camera. And so these are the things that were leading to people getting incarcerated. So we've attacked and tried to take off those enhancements. We repealed that enhancement. So we're trying to target it at different levels. But for us, the easiest piece for us to be able to get people out now is through the local county jail system and pushing local jurisdictions to end the criminalization of drug use. So that's where we're targeting it, and it's been effective. Right now, after COVID-19 has started, which has been horrific, our jail population dropped by over 5,000 people. Most of these people should have never been in there, but a significant chunk of them were there for drug offenses. So we, it's been incredible to see, and we have not begun to implement the Alternatives to Incarceration report, the Care First Jail's last report, but there is already funding to begin that process. So that's what we're targeting with the war on drugs from, but there's many different angles you can hit it from.
Great. How many people did you say have been released?
Over 5,000 people in less than 2 months.
That's incredible.
That's whole jail populations from other jurisdictions. And we were told that this was never going to happen, and it happened within a couple months. And also, just to highlight something else, is that these systems of oppression say that they're needed, but you have the sheriff of LA County saying, you know what, instead of arresting 300 people every day, we're just going to arrest 60 people every day so we don't get as many people in the jails. So right now, even during COVID-19, these systems of oppression are showing how unnecessary they are. And they're completely unnecessary for dealing with people who are having behavioral health needs, such as problematic substance use, or even just people who are using recreationally.
Wow. So Gina, I did want to turn to you to talk a little bit about the Breathe Act, because Eunices gave a great breakdown of California with California policy, but I know you guys just released this really bold federal policy that encompasses ending the war on drugs. There's a component in there that specifically addresses that point. Do you want to talk a little bit about the bill itself, and then the piece on dismantling the war on drugs?
Sure. So the Breathe Act came at a time that is in response to the most recent and most visible killings of Black people by white supremacist violence and by police violence. And what we have been, I think what for me was kind of led up to this was thinking about Breonna Taylor and thinking about how it was that militarized police could come into her home and take her life, right? And the mechanisms that made that possible were the war on drugs policies, was a culture of patriarchal enforcement of those policies, of violent patriarchal enforcement of those policies, and an anti-Black agenda. What I think, many of us advocates and organizers were expecting and experiencing was that in the midst of us being out in the streets and demanding for an end to an end to Black death, was that there would be a policy response that would match the demand. And that in the last 6 years since Ferguson, I think we've all realized that tinkering around the edges just doesn't work, that body cameras, that more doubling down on police training and investments in police to do their job, quote, do their jobs just a little bit better, quote unquote, wasn't working. It hasn't worked. We're still out here. We're still seeing our folks dying, suffering tremendous amounts of trauma and more. And so I think that when we began to see that that two things were happening. One, on the local level, like what Ioannis is talking about, we were winning, right? Like you saw all of a sudden defund take hold of the public imagination, and we were really having some actual conversations about structural and systemic change that would really address the core of the issue in an exciting way. But then you were also seeing policies that were outdated or that just don't work, kind of edge themselves into these conversations. And some of that was happening at a federal level. And I think that what the Movement for Black Lives wanted to do is provide an offering in this moment to say that we actually can legislate for our safety, and we can legislate a roadmap to us thriving as a society in which Black people are healthy, well, and free. And that is what Breathe does. Breathe is divided into 4 sections. So it's a federal omnibus bill. The first section is the section that is, I think, characteristically like what you think of when you think about defund. It is the section where we contract and divest and take money away from punitive approaches to harm, to social issues. It removes federal dollars that have contributed to things like surveillance, to militarization of police, to law enforcement's impoverishment and incarceration of Black communities, et cetera. Section 2 utilizes grant programs to incentivize states to do exactly what the Care First jail's last report is suggesting, right? Which is or recommending is to build infrastructure that are alternatives to keeping us safe. And I don't know about the word alternative because it makes it seem like there's a choice, that there are 2 choices that work. There's actually one way that works, which is what we know are these non-punitive ways, these providing peacekeeping measures and evidence and trauma-informed based approaches to public safety infrastructure. Those are the things that actually need to be built in our community, and Section 2 provides grants to incentivize the construction of those types of public safety measures. Section 3 is where things get really exciting. If Section 2 is about keeping people safe, Section 3 is about ensuring that we can thrive. So improving access to clean air, clean water, education resources. It provides economic justice initiative. I mean, this is where the bus and omnibus it gets big right here and very exciting. So there's a lot of grant support to incentivize states to do that. We also then finally in Section 4 make sure that there are accountability. That accountability is written into this bill. So one section to address what you were just asking, Ritz, about how we handle the war on drugs impacts is Section 4, which is that we establish a commission on mass criminalization reparations. And that commission would be responsible for providing reparations to those who've experienced the devastating impacts of the war on drugs and incarceration, to children and to family members included in that, who've experienced the direct impacts and direct harms. So there's a number of things that the bill does. In addition to kind of those broad sections, inside of those sections are specific repeals of criminalization of different types of drugs at the federal level, or different types of drug laws and criminalization of drugs at the federal level. It requires that the Bureau of Prisons release individuals who are serving sentences for drugs convictions within 1 year of the enactment of the act, and it authorizes immediate resentencing and early sentence terminations and termination of sentences for any person who's convicted of a solely drug offense, and a whole lot more. It gets rid of the DEA. I mean, we do it all. And this bill is intended to be a model, and I'm excited to share here that several states have already reached out to us and requested a state version of the Breathe Act to push and to implement inside of political opportunities that are available within state contexts that may not be available to us right now federally. And so this is moving. We have a state version of the bill, a federal version of the bill, and I know school boards and counties are looking to implement much of the same. And so that's the Breathe Act. If you'd like to find out more, you can go to breatheact.org and download our summary and sign up as a community co-sponsor to be among the first to receive the full version when we publish it in the coming month.
Thank you. I love that, community co-sponsor. I think that's the first time I've heard something like that. I think that's wonderful and really great. So speaking about this moment, Mitchell, I'm curious, as somebody who's worked in the drug policy reform space, is there a new or different energy with like considering that the moment and movement that's been, currently?
Yeah, it feels to me like things were already accelerating. This has certainly added fuel to that fire. But we've already seen a lot of like major changes that were happening before this latest sort of rise up of the Black Lives Matter movement. Colorado has recently passed a defelonization bill. So personal possession of almost all drugs has been defelonized, not decriminalized, but you can no longer get a felony charge for possession. There was a handful of drugs that law enforcement claimed were solely date rape drugs that they wanted to remain felonies. And even though some of the drugs on that list made no sense, the decision was made that if this is what they wanted to fight about, we'll pass the broader defelonization bill first, and then we can argue about those specific drugs later. We've also seen a lot of movement lately on the sort of medicalization of currently Schedule I substances. MDMA treatment for PTSD is very, very close to being done. 2022, I think final FDA approval will be done, and MDMA will be a legal psychotherapeutic adjunct drug in the United States. But I certainly think that what we're not fully seeing that really actually concerns me is that there is still a sort of bifurcation between the drug reform movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. You still see people in the drug reform movement who don't see the connection between the drug war and racism, right? Particularly among the cannabis legalization side, you often see this like, oh, we don't need to talk about, it's just the drugs are illegal and the people who are doing drugs got arrested. That has nothing to do with race, which is purely nonsense. Both historically, right? We know historically why these laws were passed, but also we know that, so I'm of mixed indigenous, Hispanic, and Russian ancestry. And so I'm often very white presenting, particularly when I was younger. I often passed as white. And at 11, I sort of moved from a relatively poor Hispanic community to a relatively affluent, primarily white community. And so I was in a really formative period of my life when I got to see that. So I know what I know what defunding the police looks like. It looks like the suburbs, right? None of my white friends growing up in a middle-class suburb were ever stopped and frisked. But I'll tell you now, if they had done stop and frisk in our neighborhood, every single person I know would have gone to jail, right? Everybody I knew smoked pot in high school, like literally everybody. We all would have gone to jail. So we already know what defunding the police looks like. It looks like the suburbs. It looks like, it looks like Harvard. Stop and frisk would do really well on college campuses, right? Well, from a numbers perspective. Bars outside of Wall Street is another place where stop and frisk would be like but we never see that. And so the disconnect between that, I think, needs to end. I think we need to recognize that the drug war is first and foremost a tool of white supremacy. That's what it was designed at. That's how it works. Top to bottom, that is what it is. And so we need to build that recognition and the connections between these two movements, where we have within Black Lives Matter, we have a better understanding of there are allies that can come in, and realistically, the drug reform people are often really politically connected. There's often connections there that would be really useful, particularly in states that legalized early, places like California and Colorado, where now we have many politicians who were put in place largely by by marijuana lobbying money. And so there are connections that can be made there. But also from the drug reform side, we really need to kill this myth that the drug war is a race neutral thing. It's just not the reality. And so I do see more happening on this. But I also often worry that we're going to see what happened after marijuana legalization, where a lot of the sort of wind came out of the sails of the broader drug reform community, right? We've legalized the main drug that people do, and marijuana is undeniably the most commonly used drug. And so there is some validity to that belief that, like, oh, we've legalized marijuana, so we've fixed the drug war. And I'm concerned that we're going to see that happen with things like defelonization, which I think are great. I love these incremental changes. But to me, even decriminalization is not enough, because decriminalization does not fix adulteration within black markets. It doesn't keep people out of jail who are dealing. And so to me, the only sort of real solution here is the creation of legal regulated marketplaces that are not for profit, right? I'm not saying let Coca-Cola come in and start selling cocaine again. But not for profit, 501c3 drug distribution through regulated channels, to me, is a better solution than just decriminalization, because I don't want drug dealers to go to jail either, right? Drug dealers shouldn't go to jail either. They're often people who are themselves experiencing problematic substance use disorder. They're trying to feed their own drug habits, or they're people who are economically disadvantaged and don't have any other opportunities. I want to see all of those issues fixed, not just legalizing possession and then still locking up everyone else who's sort of in the tertiary spheres of the drug war. And so, yeah, that's what I'd really like to see, is a movement for full legalization, not just decrim.
Yeah, same. And I think that having conversations like this, and really, again, like digging down into how race and racism plays into all of this, I think is really important. So I'm so glad that we were able to have this conversation at the summit to better inform people who are pushing for policy, other advocates, and just generally drug enthusiasts. So, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I'd like to thank our viewers for joining us. We will have a live Q&A session, so please stay tuned for that. So we could, if there's anything here that really caught your attention, you should ask our panelists during that Q&A. But yeah, thank you all so much for being here. I did want to ask the audience to please visit the National Drug Policy Reform Summit webpage. And under this panel, you'll find a resources tab that's called Free Them Now. That will lead you to an action page where it's a Drug Policy Alliance action page that will allow you to get in touch with your member of Congress, asking that they depopulate jails, prisons at the state, local, and federal level. We could certainly use your support in doing that. As was discussed here, there are so many people who really shouldn't, nobody should be in detention, but especially not in the middle of a global pandemic. So we could certainly use your help bringing this issue to your member of Congress. So please visit that resource page and engage with that action. Thank you again to our panelists, and thank you to our audience for joining.
Hi.
Hey everybody, welcome. Thanks for joining us for this Q&A today. We're here again with our panelists all the way from Los Angeles. Joining us, we have Eunices Hernandez. and Gina Clayton Johnson. And from right outside Denver, we have Mitchell Gomez. We're so excited to be here with you guys and have the ability to answer some of these great questions that are coming in. So given that this panel talked about the history of the war on drugs, I think this question is really important to answer. So whoever wants to take it, go for it. But there's a question in here about the bipartisan roots of the war on drugs. I think that's really important to talk about because, in fact, both parties have contributed to the mechanism that we see today. Does somebody want to speak to that?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think that's a really important acknowledgement, right? That simply voting for one party or the other is not going to fix these issues. These issues were built by both parties, and it's really going to take a sort of bipartisan effort and boots on the ground, not just voting. Like, it's probably going to take a lot of direct action to undo the damage of the war on drugs, and it's going to take a really sort of thoughtful, long process. I saw a vote the other day that, or a post the other day that somebody said, I'm taking a hiatus on criticizing Democrats until November, and then the work starts, right? And so, like, one of the things that DanceSafe does is we run the Amend the RAVAC campaign, which is a really sort of egregious piece of legislation that was written and passed by Joe Biden when he was a senator. And so, yeah, this is a bipartisan issue, and fixing it is going to be a bipartisan issue as well.
That's right.
Yeah, and just to add to that, there's other folks like, the Clintons, Hillary Clinton talking about super predators. All of that was born out of the rhetoric of, that helped create the war on drugs. And just to again uplift what Mitchell said around Biden, he was an architect of a lot of the policies that we're now grappling with. And so it is going to take everyone to fix the damage, but also it's heavy responsibility on us to ensure that any policy that moves forward around ending the war on drugs, decriminalizing drugs, legalize them, include an automatic piece for the relief to be applied to people who have, one, gone through the system and have, convictions, but also people who have had like losses to their housing or, the generational trauma. Like, this is a moment where we need to talk about reparations, particularly for Black communities. And that's something that we cannot avoid talking about. And it's a responsibility of not just us as advocates, but also Democrats, Republicans, and everybody in between who were the ones who actually made and authored these policies to make them happen.
Yeah, that's actually a really great segue into our next question. So somebody asks, do you think there will be a national truth and reconciliation trial to expose the human life costs of the drug war? As you were saying, Onisis, I think this is such a critical component of any drug war policy. So right now, the Drug Policy Alliance is working to pass a comprehensive marijuana bill that you may have heard talked about today called the MORE Act. And we made sure that reparative justice was a component of that because we know that we can't legalize any substance without addressing the harm that's been done to Black and Brown communities across this country. Did anybody else want to speak to that? I know folks on this panel have thought a lot about reparations and also just reparative justice.
Absolutely. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I think this is absolutely vital. And it's one of the reasons why it is written into, we have something similar written into Section 4 of the Breathe Act at Movement for Black Lives. We have, in the Breathe Act, it would develop a mass criminalization reparations commission that would be responsible for providing reparations to individuals who have experienced the devastating impacts of the war on drugs, but not only kind of within the context of the criminalization of drugs, but also mass criminalization and all of the impacts that stem from the broad criminalization of our communities. And so that includes drugs, but it does not only, it doesn't just begin and end there. And it also would provide reparations and really an examination of the impact that the war on drugs has had on women, on children, on family members, on trans communities, and other populations who have been specifically hard hit as a result of the last 40 plus years of aggressive drug policy.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear what that reparative justice in that bill looks like. So in the MORE Act, one thing that we made sure to include was that the industry also be inclusive of people with past marijuana convictions, low-income Black and Brown individuals, people who are grossly underrepresented in the industry. We also made sure to create a trust fund for communities that have been most harmed by the war on drugs, where they could have things like legal services for expungements, for example, where they could have job training, access to like education support that they might need, youth mentoring, that sort of thing. In the Breathe Act, what do the reparative components look like? And I'm asking just because I think people sometimes have a hard time, understanding what that could look like.
Yeah, so we think of reparations kind of in the vision of HR 40 and think about it broadly to include cash and financial compensation for harm, but also all of the things that you're talking about, right? So trauma healing, being able to provide people with the services that they need in order to be made whole, essentially, as impossible as that might be, to at least make some real attempts toward community wholeness through, and why I say impossible is that 400 years of oppression and devastation of communities is not what we're trying to, provide quick fixes for. But what we are saying is that it needs to be resources. It needs to be holistic and innovative and far-reaching support for communities and for not just individuals who starting and especially for individuals who are incarcerated and who are charged and convicted under all of these laws, but extending also to family members, because we know that this impact has been an intergenerational one.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So we have a couple of minutes here. I'm going to throw this question at her because I think it's a good one. If somebody could take a stab at trying to answer it in like a minute or so. So how do parents talk to school districts about drug decriminalization? Or rather, I would say, how do parents talk to school districts about getting away from abstinence-only programs? Folks have an idea?
So I'm not a parent. I don't have children, but I feel like I'm close enough to that age to see some of the things, but also seeing, through the development of the Care First report on how we don't really need to focus on abstinence programs, but how do we end the criminalization of young people in schools? Like that should be the main question. Like how do we remove probation officers and police, and how do we get more supportive services? In LA, for example, last year there was a huge protest from the school teachers here in the LAUSD district, and it was because they didn't have enough librarians. Yet that is the same school district that has the second largest police department in the city of Los Angeles. And so when we talk about what needs to be done, we need to focus on that piece so that we can actually have the resources to provide services in our schools. Like the schools are hubs, right? Children go there, families go there to pick up their children. And so that is one of the places where we need to invest more in and invest more of the type of services that we know actually help people, because what we've seen is that coercive treatment, forced treatment, abstinence-only treatment doesn't really help support people through their problematic substance use. And so what does help? And so there are Mitchell will probably touch on this, but there's a lot of harm reduction programs that could be implemented. And also there's a great curriculum that Maritza, I'm sure that you can speak to more about, but the safety first, curriculum, that is something that, growing up, I didn't know how to talk about like drugs with my parents. And so it was never talked about. And so this curriculum has been extremely impactful on myself to be able to talk to young people that are in my lives. But that's another thing that we should make sure to incorporate. But first it's around how do we get the money from that's criminalizing our students in schools and shift that over to actually how do we get them to support our students in schools and families.
Mitchell, a few seconds left. Did you want to answer?
Yeah, so for me, it really is just about like hammering the data over and over and over again that shows that abstinence-only education, whether it's regarding sex or drugs, makes the problem worse, right? The DARE people who went through the traditional abstinence-only DARE program were statistically more likely to use drugs than people who had no drug education at all. And I think that's the data is very, very clear that this just doesn't work. And when you hammer that home over and over and over again, parents sort of really do get the message that this is harming their children, that you have to educate them honestly and openly about what drugs really are and the real risks there, and provide with the harm reduction services they need, that if the kids are choosing to use substances, which a lot of them are, that we do have the tools to make sure they can get through that substance use without developing problematic behavior, without killing themselves, without having harms.
Yeah, thank you. And as Eunice said, please do check out the Safety First curriculum on the Drug Policy Alliance website. That's all the time we have today. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us. I know this was early on the West Coast. Thank you again. This was a great conversation. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Amber Littlejohn with the Minority Cannabis Business Association. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce you to our next speaker, Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Congresswoman Lee has been a champion for drug policy reform and unwavering in her commitment to seeing equity and justice at the forefront of federal cannabis policy. On behalf of MCBA and all of our partner organizations represented here today, I want to thank the Congresswoman for all that she does and for joining us here today. Thank you.
I'm Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and I represent California's beautiful 13th Congressional District. Thank you all for being a part of the National Drug Policy Reform Seminar. I want to thank you for all the work that you're doing to push this movement forward. The American people want meaningful cannabis reform, and yes, Congress needs to catch up. As co-chair of the Congressional Cannabis Caucus, I am excited for what lies ahead in our fight to finally end the federal prohibition on cannabis. We all know that this is an issue of racial justice. The harmful impacts of the failed war on drugs not only threatens the health, safety, and economic security of Black Americans around the country, it feeds into the prison industrial complex. And yes, it's yet another extension of the systemic racism we are fighting every day to dismantle. It's crucial that we pass the MORE Act, which aims to correct the historical injustices of the failed drug policies that have disproportionately impacted communities of color and low-income communities. This critical legislation would decriminalize cannabis at the federal level, seek restorative justice for those wrongfully incarcerated for cannabis, and reinvest in communities most devastated by the war on drugs. Our work is not done until we provide real opportunity for people of color to access this booming industry. In Congress, I will keep working alongside you to ensure that our cannabis policies are fair, equitable, and inclusive. Thank you again for all of the work that you do. Let us keep up the fight.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the National Drug Policy Reform Seminar. My name is Justin Streckel, and in addition to being NORML's political director, I also serve as its federal lobbyist. And I'm very excited for the next panel, The Advocates Behind the MORE Act, where I sit down with Drug Policy Alliance's Queen Adusui, and we have a conversation about what went into the making of the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. This critical legislation could become the first ever bill to end marijuana prohibition passed by the United States House of Representatives, and we're very excited to talk to you about it now. Save your questions for the end. We look forward to them.
Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Demko. I am the cannabis editor at Politico, and we're here today to talk about the MORE Act and how that would change federal marijuana policy and what it might mean for the country and for politics. Queen, I'm hoping you can kind of set the table for us. Give us the big strokes of what this legislation would do and why you think it's the right approach to federal marijuana policy at this point in time.
Thank you, Paul. I'm excited and happy to be here. My name is Queen Adusui, and I'm with the Drug Policy Alliance, and I'm also a co-lead of the Marijuana Justice Coalition. And just to start off, I really want to emphasize the fact that ending marijuana prohibition has to be done in a comprehensive way. If not, it will leave behind the individuals and families and communities who really bore the brunt of the decades of failed policies that we've seen throughout this country. A piecemeal approach towards ending marijuana prohibition will certainly set a tone for decades post-legalization that would really center systematic racism and again contribute to economies that leave behind people who have been impacted by criminalization, leaving behind people who use drugs, and leave behind Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people who, again, tend to bear the brunt of overcriminalization and overenforcement. So when it comes to ending marijuana prohibition, DPA and my colleagues within the Marijuana Justice Coalition, Normal, Just Leadership USA, the Leadership Conference, ACLU, and others, we joined forces in 2018 to actualize this mandate that we can't move marijuana reform and policy that leaves people behind. So we intentionally wanted to put together a bill that would address all of the intersecting issues that marijuana prohibition has allowed to impact people on the individual level. So we combined, organizations that worked or focused on drug policy traditionally, as well as organizations that focused on the different individuals and different aspects of the harms of criminalization in order to really create a comprehensive and intersecting coalition that would help address all the different pieces of ending prohibition. So not just about ending federal criminalization, not just descheduling, but really being in tune with the fact that we need to include expungement, we need to include resentencing. So I can give a quick rundown of the bill. It first and foremost deschedules, which officially ends federal criminalization of marijuana. It doesn't change the status of marijuana in any given state, but it'll allow states that are regulating and legalizing marijuana to not have to fear federal interference. It protects non-citizens who are still facing immigration-related consequences in legal states. It allows for banking services to be utilized by legal companies in legal states. It also allows for veterans to be able to get recommended medical marijuana through the VA, and a host of other collateral benefits just from ending federal criminalization. But in addition, the MORE Act also, again, includes expungement and resentencing. It includes provisions to protect people who need access to public benefits from being denied it because of marijuana use or previous conviction. And one of my favorite pieces of the bill is that it actually puts a modest 5% tax on the industry, on the manufacturer side of marijuana sales, to create an Office of Cannabis Justice, which would host and house 3 different grant programs that are intended to really get at, reparative justice in both the sense of communities impacted by criminalization, and then also looking towards making the industry that's born of all of this advocacy inclusive and diverse, and one that isn't leaving behind people who, again, carried really all of the harms of decades of failed policies. So the first grant is around community reinvestment. Communities over-policed, communities impacted by the war on drugs are able to access this money for any number of resources, from reentry services to youth services. There's even part of that money is carved out around substance misuse treatment. And the other 2 grants are directed towards making the industry, again, more inclusive and more diverse. So there's a grant meant for states and localities who are looking to legalize, incentivizing them to do things like retroactive expungement, which costs states money, and this fund provides money for states to do that. And then separately, there's a SBA funds for entrepreneurs who are directly impacted by criminalization, entrepreneurs who are women, who are minorities, looking to enter the industry to reduce the financial barrier to entry. So that's a mouthful, but it's intentional because the bill is meant to address all of these different issues and all of these different aspects. Again, under a democratically led House, it would be tragic for the opportunity to pass marijuana reform to have a bipartisan bill that addresses all of the issues across the aisle and more to not be touched. So I'm excited to pass this off to Justin so he can add to the conversation about what is viable politically right now. But the MORE Act was intentionally crafted to really be honest and be truthful about the harms of marijuana prohibition and take steps towards addressing them.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you, Queen. I think that pivots perfectly to Justin. Give us the lay of the land on Capitol Hill right now. Where are we with this legislation, and what are the prospects for it moving forward?
Yeah, you got it, Paul. Thank you so very much. And just to lift up what Queen said, I think she put it perfectly about the need for a comprehensive legislation, i.e. the MORE Act, to advance to fully address the harms of criminalization, because we can't undo the pain that has been inflicted on individuals, but we can stop inflicting pain on our fellow citizens and non-citizens alike, and try to mitigate the ongoing damage through the expungement policies. So when in my role as Normal's political director and federal lobbyist, I'm regularly in communication with congressional offices of all different ideological stripes, talking to them about different provisions of this bill and where it fits into the whole. And I cannot underscore this enough. We so very much appreciate the leadership of Chairman Nadler on the House side and Senator Harris on the Senate side for taking the reins and leading these legislative efforts. Last November, when the MORE Act was taken up in a committee markup, and it became the first ever time in American history that a bill would end prohibition had advanced through a committee of the judiciary. So this bill is already historic in that regard, and we seek to carry on that momentum moving forward to be able to show to the American people who their lawmakers supported. Did they support criminalization, prohibition, and oppression? Or did they support freedom of choice, personal responsibility for adults, and legitimizing this emerging and nascent industry and trying to provide opportunities for those who've been engaging in the marijuana commerce for decades, an opportunity to be tax-paying job creators? So we think the political prospects are brighter than ever. And particularly given the fact that former Vice President Joe Biden has tapped Senator Harris to become the vice presidential Democratic nominee, and her role of leading this legislation in the Senate, it would be political malpractice for the House Democrats to not take up this legislation and be able to use it as a platform to demonstrate this is how the country should be governed when it comes to marijuana policy reform. We need to undo the harm. We need to stop harming people going forward, and we need to provide a pathway for adults to be able to access this consumer good. As Queen mentioned, it's a bipartisan bill. When the bill advanced out of the House Judiciary Committee, two Republicans voted in favor of it, and we suspect that we could get a significant number of Republicans to vote in favor of it if and when it comes to the floor. As anything in Washington, nobody likes to see the sausage getting made, and we don't expect Republicans to support every component of the legislation, but there are enough underlying tenets that would be reflective and acceptable to many Republicans to be able to get them to yes to vote on the bill. And in just the last couple of weeks, we've seen another 10 Democrats co-sponsor the bill. And we've been engaged in a lot of critical conversations with key gatekeepers in the congressional process to ensure smooth passage if and when this bill is called up for a vote in September.
Okay. I want to push back on that a little bit and maybe throw this to both of you. I mean, as you're well aware, cannabis banking legislation passed the House last September by an overwhelming vote with almost half of Republicans backing it as well, but that legislation has gone nowhere in the Republican-controlled Senate. Why, given the challenges in getting through the Senate on such a limited bill with such broad bipartisan support, does it make sense to focus efforts on a much more far-reaching piece of legislation that doesn't have as significant Republican support?
Queen, you want to take that first?
Well, I was just going to say that the dynamics in the House and the dynamics in the Senate are completely different. So when Justin was speaking, I think he was referring to Republicans in the House. The dynamics with marijuana reform in the Senate is a whole different conversation given who's leading the Senate. But in the House, again, something more far-reaching, the racial justice piece around the MORE Act, the criminal justice pieces of the MORE Act, that's actually what got this bill the furthest in the House. That's what brought most members on board. And criminal justice reform is increasingly a bipartisan issue. Marijuana reform is undoubtedly a bipartisan issue. And again, in the House in particular, which already passed the Safe Banking Act, a narrow bill, the House has the political viability to pass something like this, and they actually really have the responsibility to do so, given who they represent and the people, again, who will be left behind if this bill is not taken up.
And if I could build upon that, we can refer to the Safe Banking Act as a cannabis-related bill, but we can also acknowledge that it's not. the Safe Banking Act is a bill that provides protections for financial institutions and major banks to avoid prosecution when it comes to providing basic banking services for marijuana and marijuana related businesses. So it's one of those things that can be argued both ways, but it is undeniable that the House of Representatives has not taken up anything to address the criminalization of marijuana. And particularly given this moment that we're in, where we see, tens of thousands of Americans regularly hitting the streets to demand justice and substantial reform of criminal justice policies federally, when we see, 11 states have already moved forward to end marijuana prohibition and move towards an adult use commercial market, and 33 states having a medical market, the pressure is there. And it's critical in our view that when a bill is taken up to end marijuana prohibition, it does not leave those behind who have suffered as a result of criminalization. And do I expect Mitch McConnell to, if the House passes the MORE Act, do I expect Mitch McConnell to say, okay, terrific, let's give the Senate an opportunity to vote? No. But the political realities surrounding this are not just pertaining to cannabis. It's pertaining to every aspect of American public policy. And it's our hope where we see the elections coming up in September or November, that, when voters go to the polls, for example, in Arizona, where there is simultaneously an adult use ballot initiative and a Senator, Martha McSally, up for re-election, who has never said a positive word about adult use cannabis, that voters will simultaneously approve adult use cannabis and take into consideration the fact that Martha McSally is not representative of the public prevailing sentiment in the state of Arizona, and either she changes her tune or doesn't return to Washington, D.C. So, and we see this political force moving, with Senator Cory Gardner. I take him at his word that he's trying his best to convince Mitch McConnell to advance cannabis policy reforms to protect his state of Colorado, but clearly his best is not good enough. And we have a lot of folks who have been putting pressure on the Senate Majority Leader. But that doesn't absolve Democrats of responsibilities of governing that they hold in the House of Representatives. And if the Democrats want to continue to be the party that has an overwhelming number of its members saying that they support ending marijuana criminalization, then they should do so by wielding the power that they hold in advancing the MORE Act.
Okay. I want to drill down a little bit more. Oh, sorry.
To that. I really don't want to understate the political climate we're in right now and how things are changing. 2020 was historic in a lot of different ways, but trying to maintain the status quo is not going to continue to be politically feasible, especially for Democrats. Folks, like Dustin said, folks are hitting the streets and folks are demanding really progressive things that are necessary.
Uh-oh. Queen dropped. Well, we could just keep the.
It was a dramatic exit.
I know. She just dropped the mic. Well, while Queen jumps back on, we can just keep going for just a moment.
Well, let me pivot a little more to the elections, Justin. As you're well aware, the Democratic platform did not include support for federal legalization, despite polling that shows roughly 2/3 of Americans, an overwhelming majority of Democrats, supporting that policy. I guess how much of a setback was that, and how concerned are you about that not being a part of the official Democratic Party platform?
Well, in this regard, language matters a lot. And if I can put my wonky policy hat on for just a moment, there's no such thing as a federal legalization bill. We live in a representative federalist republic, and it is up to states to decide whether or not they legalize the commerce of marijuana to adults over the age of 21 with reasonable restrictions for its access. There's the parlance of our times. We always talk about legalization, but the mechanics of it at the federal level, all we can do is end marijuana prohibition and criminalization. And we think that way it'll arm our activists and advocates around the country who have been lobbying and advocating to their state lawmakers, it will take away the state lawmakers' tired trope of, well, it's federally prohibited, and it'll really shift the focus onto them. So, whether or not Joe Biden or the Democratic Party ever utters the word legalization is really secondary to the underlying policies that we're trying to advance. We're trying to end prohibition. We're trying to end criminalization. So when Joe Biden says he supports decriminalization, that's terrific. That means descheduling cannabis. That's the way Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer talks about it in reference to legislation he's introduced, the Marijuana Freedom and Opportunity Act, which many of the provisions of that bill have been incorporated into the MORE Act. That's the way Democratic Caucus Chairman in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, refers to decriminalization, again, as the lead sponsor of the Marijuana Freedom and Opportunity Act. Decriminalization, at the federal level, means descheduling, and we need the Democratic Party to fully internalize that. And their rhetoric is their rhetoric. I'm not concerned about the rhetoric. I'm concerned about the policy.
Okay. What about Queen? Welcome back.
Apologies, my computer crashed me. It was they anticipated what I was going to say. But what I was actually saying was that the political moment we're in cannot be understated how historic it is, and Democrats are going to have to figure out a new strategy and really get in tune with the people that they're representing, because folks are actually calling for more than actually legalization of marijuana. It's even beyond marijuana legalization. The nation has already been here in terms of support for ending criminalization for marijuana. And looking, forward in terms of drug policy reform, we're going to be talking about removing criminal penalties for all drugs. As we start to really grapple with the talking point of, drug use should be treated as a public health issue and not a criminal one. That cannot remain just around marijuana. So Democrats need to kind of get on board with where the country is moving, and where folks on the ground are moving. People are not settling, or not comfortable at least with settling with the okie doke anymore. And so, the conversation of really trying to move, our most senior political figures around marijuana legalization just feels, out of touch with where we are as a country, or where we are as a people in this country. And again, we can't continue to rely just on talking points like Justin mentioned. If you support decriminalizing marijuana, if you support ending criminal penalties, you support descheduling, and you also support, the ending collateral consequences and reinvesting in communities.
I think I want to go to both of you with another question, and that's, there has been a national debate over criminal justice policies, particularly in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and others. And on Capitol Hill, you saw the House pass a pretty far-reaching package, and you saw Senate Republicans come out with something much more limited in scope that didn't go anywhere. But neither of those dealt with marijuana policy. I guess I'm curious twofold, sort of, why is that? And I'm guessing you both think it's a mistake not to be including that as part of the discussion. What make the case for why it should be part of that?
I'll let Queen go first.
Well, so I'll say that the policing conversation in Congress at the time, post the killing of George Floyd and others this year, is one where it was one of the first opportunities in Congress of recent where we were able to actually tackle policing directly. And that bill, the House bill that passed, actually didn't even include all of the things that folks actually really wanted to include, including quick knock warrants and things of that sort. It just didn't. At least speaking on behalf of DPA, it wasn't necessarily the right moment to throw in marijuana in that way, even though the issues are connected, they are aligned. Ending marijuana prohibition is very much a part of, removing tools from law enforcement. But the case with Breonna Taylor, the case with George Floyd, it wasn't just about legalization. But at least for us, the strategy was to address that bill, the policing effort, to really, address warrants and the ways that the war on drugs is enforced. And then also doing the MORE Act effort separately, but built off of that, if that makes sense. So it wasn't necessarily that, a missed opportunity, at least speaking on behalf of DPA again, a missed opportunity because, again, the MORE Act already had a different kind of political viability than even the policing bill, which was born of moments that have happened. But they're intrinsically connected, is what I'll say.
And this is one of those areas where DPA and Normal took a little bit different approaches, because we fundamentally do view marijuana criminalization and ending it as police reform, because an American is put into steel handcuffs every 48 seconds in this country. The criminalization of marijuana is one of the most commonly used legal tools for law enforcement to enter into an interaction with an individual. And there are, even in states that had decriminalization, there were a lot of loopholes that were regularly exploited that were perpetually used against people of color and poor people, to move it from a civil violation to a criminal violation. One example was the public view exemption in New York, which DPA and Normal chapters and other advocates helped shut down. But where stop and frisk, if somebody had a dime bag in their pocket, that's a civil violation if caught. But under stop and frisk, a law enforcement officer would empty that individual's pocket, put it on the hood of their car. Now it's in public view. Now that individual has a criminal charge against them. So we do view ending marijuana criminalization and prohibition as a police reform bill, because it's going to reform the way and reduce the powers that police have to infringe on the individual freedoms and liberties of people, right? So, I do think it was a missed opportunity, conditioned that if the House doesn't pass the MORE Act. If the House does pass the MORE Act, it's not a missed opportunity because it's part of a larger narrative and a larger stream of legislative action. But if the House fails to take up the MORE Act, then it absolutely is an abject failure of House Democrats being willing to comprehensively address the social harms that marijuana criminalization plays in with the broader distrust of law enforcement. And we think that's really important to address.
And if I might add, I think what was difficult about that effort and that conversation was that in a policing bill around drugs, we would want to see something more than just marijuana. We would want to see removal of criminal penalties for all drugs. Like, if we're really thinking about how to fundamentally change policing practices, marijuana is a huge first step. It is absolutely a huge first step. But in the context of that bill and in the context of, what was arising from the movement and the momentum on the ground, it would have been something even far-reaching than just marijuana for us.
Okay. I think we got to wrap things up here. But it's been a terrific conversation. Thank you all for letting me participate and be part of this, and for the stimulating conversation.
Thank you so very much, Paul, and Paul particularly. Thank you and Politico for having reporters who are covering this policy reform, because ultimately we're not going to be able to have a substantial debate where we can increase the level of trust with policymakers without the kind of reporting that you guys do, and helping lawmakers dispel reefer madness because it's purely predicated on racial animus and fear, not evidence or science. So thank you for what you do too as well.
Yes, thank you, Paul, and thanks, Justin, for joining me in this conversation. And also just thank you to everyone who's actually called their members of Congress on behalf of this bill. All the pressure that folks are putting on their members of Congress, really forcing them to think about marijuana from this context, has been extremely helpful to moving this bill to the floor, and hopefully we'll actually see it actualized in this country.
So last thought, if I may, both Normal and Drug Policy Alliance have action alerts for folks to contact their lawmakers. They'll be regularly shared throughout the stream. Please contact your lawmakers, share our action alerts to get your friends to do so, and together we're going to reform America. So thanks. Have a good day, guys. Hey there. So thank you so very much for tuning in to our pre-recorded panel. And now we are very excited to take your questions that have been coming in. I want to just shout out Eric. I know he's not on the screen right now, but he's going to be feeding us the questions that have been coming in from the various live streams we have hosted. So we're just going to just dive right in. The first question that we have was from Robert on YouTube, and he asked, where does the MORE Act state that my VA doctor can recommend? Decriminalized and legalized are two different things, and I feel like I feel like it's false information to the veterans community. And you know what? That's a very important question to address how federal policy works when we talk about prohibition and the nuance in between the federal government and state governments. By ending federal marijuana prohibition, we're going to make sure that the VA doctors who are working in states in federal buildings, but in states that have legalized medical cannabis, are able to fill out the recommendation form that the state hosts for a medical marijuana access. So in the 33 states in the District of Columbia and the U.S. territories that have legalized medical cannabis, veterans will no longer have to go out of network in order to be able to obtain a recommendation. So they won't have to pay those out-of-network fees out of pocket. But unfortunately, in the 17 states that maintain no consumer access for medical cannabis patients, or for patients who would benefit from medical cannabis, those patients, those veterans are still out in the cold. But those are programs that need to get set up at the state level, not the federal level. We can continue to evolve veterans policies when it comes to marijuana federally, and we hope to do so. And we're looking for more people to get engaged in that topic. But unfortunately, this is something that the veteran service organizations just really haven't engaged with on a substantive way about how we can increase veterans' access to therapeutic cannabis. Queen, you want to take the next one?
Sure. The next question we got was, how is the MORE Act different from the States Act? First and foremost, the States Act was written in a completely different time, in a different political moment. The States Act doesn't remove marijuana from the schedules, and it actually maintains federal criminalization. So, at this point, with everything that's happened in terms of increased support on and off the Hill, the States Act is really a non-starter. It maintains a lot of the collateral consequences of prohibition, and it's meant to protect states and maintain the status quo of states that are regulating and prevent them from experiencing federal intervention. But again, it maintains federal criminalization, and there's a lot of collateral consequences from that. And the MORE Act is just a more comprehensive approach that actually officially ends marijuana prohibition while investing in communities most adversely impacted by the war on drugs.
And if I can just add to Queen's answer about the States Act, it's really important to acknowledge that the States Act just very plainly does not remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act. Period, full stop. It doesn't. It maintains marijuana Schedule I status. Would the States Act be better than the status quo? Absolutely. But could we do better? Absolutely. And that's why we're really pushing hard for a vote on the MORE Act in the House of Representatives, because we believe that's a hospitable chamber for reform. And there's nothing preventing Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, who's the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, from taking up the States Act and engaging in a substantive conversation between the two chambers, because the States Act is a Republican-led bill predominantly, but the Republican-led chamber has refused to consider it. So that's just where we're stuck at. We're working with who we got, where we got, how we can. The next thing is, it's not so much a question, but I really just appreciated the comment we got on the normal live stream here. David Stokes says, I'm so glad Jeff Sessions lost his Senate primary last month. And you know what, David? I agree with you. Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III was one of the worst heinous prohibitionists to ever sit in the chamber of the Senate. And he said from the dais of the Senate just a few months before he got nominated to be the Attorney General under Donald Trump, good people do not smoke marijuana. Now, I don't know about you. I know a number of good people who occasionally consume cannabis. I know a lot of good people who consume it on a regular basis. There are some good people who don't consume cannabis. I'm not meaning to take away from them. But Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III was one of the most heinous individuals when it came to a worldview about how the federal government and state government should oppress people and incarcerate people, particularly Black people, when it came to marijuana policy. And we are so glad that he is going to no longer play an active role in federal policy going forward. Queen?
So on that, the next question really just asked, why isn't the approach descheduling first and then working to get the reparative justice pieces after? And essentially the answer to that is that Congress moves, one, really slow on everything. And Congress often has one bite at the apple to get at different issues. And in this case with marijuana, the House already actually voted on a marijuana reform bill, one that addressed the industry. And this Congress, they're trying to push them to actually not leave, communities behind. But historically, Congress doesn't hit at the same issues multiple times. So because we have the political viability to actually not leave communities behind, and also because we have the responsibility to not leave communities behind, we're actively wanting to move descheduling along with the reparative justice pieces to not, again, leave people. It's unfathomable that this war would be waged disproportionately on communities of color, low-income communities, and then, when we have the opportunity to reform the issues, we're leaving people behind and wanting to negotiate years down the line to hopefully get relief by then. I think that's not the position that DPA has taken, and that's not the position that the Marijuana Justice Coalition has taken. Communities are coming first when it comes to this strategy.
No, that is a really great point. And I think when we talk about how we're going to be sequencing things at the federal level, one of the areas that we think that is a way that's going to continue to increase the pressure through the normalization of retail cannabis sales. And this is an area where my colleague and good friend Queen have a little bit of a disagreement, or had a disagreement in the past, is when it comes to the Safe Banking Act. And it is the position of Normal that the enactment of the Safe Banking Act and the normalization of the further normalization of retail cannabis sales and the increased efficiency and consumer access that comes about of that is only going to increase the pressure, so that way we get a bill that fundamentally addresses the prohibition, and then it just makes it that much easier for us to advance the MORE Act, which is going to include the criminal justice reforms that we desperately need. There are other issues that the cannabis industry is pushing for, and it is very plainly my position that they can get their tax cuts when we end criminalization, and that those who have criminal records get those erased. So we're going to hold the line there. But through safe banking, particularly for medical patients, and given the COVID pandemic, if we want to make sure that patients have access to delivery, they have access to contactless pickup, if they don't have to handle currency, it's all positives. One thing, Jax Finkel, the executive director from Texas Normal, shout out Texas Normal, just commented on the post, bringing up, referring to Sessions, and there is another prohibitionist Sessions that has to do with Congress, and this is Pete Sessions. Peter Sessions was former congressman in Texas and the chairman of the Rules Committee, which is one of the most powerful committees in the House of Representatives because it controls what goes to the floor. And he was a militant prohibitionist, and he fortunately was defeated in 2018 by Colin Allred, now Congressman Allred. But he is running again. He moved to a different district that he believed would be more politically suitable for him, and there is the prospect that he is likely to be successful. The question is would he lose his seniority because he's returning to the House of Representatives as a freshman? It's our sincere hope that the Republicans do not reinstall him in a leadership role, because no party should have prohibitionists in leadership roles within their governmental structures. Queen, you want to take the next one?
Yes, so we have a question from Jessica Kelly. Do you think components of the MORE Act can be incorporated into statewide adult use marijuana efforts? Yes, and I think that's another example of why it was important to have Congress lead through this lens, through a racial justice lens, and lead with the commitment to providing, relief for people who have been impacted by criminalization, is to, again, set a standard and set a principle for states that are continuing to legalize. We've seen since DC has led their effort to legalize marijuana through a racial justice lens, which DC was the first place to actually do it really squarely about racial justice. We've seen states continue to go about that path and work towards that. How it's manifested in different states is a different conversation, but Congress has the duty, being the body that really kind of brought us here in the first place, to lead the effort to end criminalization through this lens of making sure that we're not leaving behind people who have been impacted.
Absolutely. Another
and just to actually add, the MORE Act also provides money for states who are interested in legalizing, to do it in a way that's equitable. So one of the grant programs in the MORE Act provides money for states and incentivizes states to do the things that the MORE Act does on the federal level.
No, and which is really wonderful, because that, just to build on what Queen said, that grant program that's going to help states set up their own programs and municipalities, that means it's going to be lower costs for local entrepreneurs to enter the marketplace. You know, in West Virginia, I like to pick on West Virginia sometimes, not the people, the government. They said that there's a $50,000 non-refundable application fee just to be considered to get a business license. Right? Like, these are the kind of barriers to entry that make sure that people who are lower, like entrepreneurs who are lower on the socioeconomic spectrum, be it because they're in historically marginalized communities, or they're, and that can mean black, white, brown, whatever. In this country, we see clear bias against people of color, but there's lots of poor white people too who would be phenomenal cannabis business owners, but they cannot overcome those barriers. So the grant program is really important to promote local ownership and local access to licenses, so we don't see the entire cannabis marketplace consolidate and we just have Mick McMarijuanas and no option for consumers. I think this is a great question for us to end on, and I want to shout out to Heed, one of our favorite writers out of Philly, who asked it. How can local media better distill congressional conversation around the MORE Act to inform and empower local residents to take action and call their reps? I think everyone should follow Tahid on Twitter and read all the things that he posts, because it's phenomenal work. And little things like what I'm about to do right now. FYI, Congressman Donald Payne of New Jersey just co-sponsored the bill, and that's within your readership area, right? Coming out of the Philly market. We're doing the best that we can to make sure that we're regularly pumping out information to arm journalists to understand who has already co-sponsored and supports this effort, who hasn't. Marijuana drives a lot of clicks, so it's an incentive for reporters and editors to put this on their docket. We only got 1 minute left, so I want to turn it over to Queen to finish to take that question and close us out.
Yeah, I would just add really paying attention to what's happening on the federal level, because things are moving. Things are absolutely moving, especially over the next few weeks. So reporters should be paying attention and reaching out to advocates who are on the ground doing the work.
Yep. Well, hey, thank you all so very much for tuning in. It's our pleasure, to represent the important ideas that we've discussed here in the halls of power. And please continue to support advocates. Support NORML, support the Drug Policy Alliance, support the Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and so many others. Contact your lawmakers, write letters to the editor, to his point. Just keep up the pressure, and thank you so much.
And just a quick plug for the Marijuana Justice Coalition members. Please go to drugpolicy.org/MJC, and then you'll see the full list of all the organizations that are part of the coalition also pushing this bill.
Thanks.
What is cannabis social equity? We tend to only form questions leading to answers which we are comfortable knowing that we have the answers to solve. Good questions present answers that create possibilities for other people. The starting point of all achievement is desire. You don't invent answers. You reveal answers by asking the right questions. When an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, then the marathon continues. We are MCBA, Cannabis Policy, Empowerment, and Connectivity. Join us.
Hello, my name is Erica Dara with Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Earl Blumenauer, a representative from Oregon. Representative Blumenauer has been a champion for cannabis policy reform, and we are so grateful to have him joining us today.
I wanted to express my appreciation to those of you at this seminar. I'm Congressman Earl Blumenauer, the founder and co-chair of the Congressional Cannabis Caucus. I wish we could be together in person, but in this era of COVID crisis, it's not meant to be. I would thank you for your work to help change our nation's outdated drug laws. Right now, support for legal cannabis is at an all-time high. In fact, more than 2/3 of Americans support full legalization, up from 36% in 2005. Despite this dramatic change in public opinion, federal marijuana policy remains rooted in the past. That's why I'm leading the charge in Congress to end the senseless prohibition on cannabis, to ensure restorative justice for those impacted by the failed war on drugs, to advance cannabis research and expand equal access to cannabis for our veterans. And of course, there's much more. Because of the continued collaboration and hard work with many of you, we've had some amazing wins in this last year. Last month, the House approved my legislation to protect legal state, territory, and tribal cannabis programs from federal intervention by the Department of Justice. Last month, the MORE Act, our legislation to legalize cannabis and ensure restorative justice, was passed by the House Judiciary Committee. And last year, our bill to give cannabis businesses access to banking services passed out of the House with an overwhelming vote, 321 yes votes. And the momentum for our movement continues to grow, especially as more and more people understand the inseparable link between outmoded drug policies and the urgent need for racial justice. This month, we received our 87th co-sponsor for the MORE Act. Also, this week, Kamala Harris, the Senate champion for the MORE Act, was named Democratic Vice Presidential nominee. And we're continuing to work towards a floor vote on this critical legislation in September. Of course, we still have much more work to do, which is why the conversations you're having today are so critical. I want to thank you again to the National Drug Policy Reform Seminar for having me today, and for everyone attending the event who is committed to ending the failed prohibition of cannabis once and for all. Keep up the great work, and let's stay in touch as we work together for these much-needed lasting reforms.
Hi, my name is Alan Robinson. I'm with Wisconsin NORML. Our next panel will be looking at winning with marijuana in a swing state. To open our discussion, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Lieutenant Governor of Wisconsin, Mandela Barnes. Lieutenant Governor Barnes has been a champion for marijuana decriminalization in Wisconsin because he knows that it will free up resources in our legal system and help to end the racial disparities in arrests. We're so grateful to him for joining us today. I hope you enjoy our conversation, and please stay tuned for the live Q&A presentation just afterwards.
Hello everybody, I'm Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, and it's so great to be joining you for the National Drug Policy Reform Seminar. And of course, I would love to be able to join you all in person, but it's still not safe to do so given the high levels of COVID-19 that still exist in every region of the state. So thank you to the organizers of this seminar for taking this pandemic seriously and prioritizing the health and safety of our communities. And thank you all for wearing a face covering or a mask whenever you're indoors in a place that isn't your own home or when around others outside of your household. These are simple measures, but they can save lives. And I'm excited for all the discussions on marijuana policy that are going to take place because this is an issue that has gone unaddressed in Wisconsin for far too long. And as public opinion on marijuana legalization has changed dramatically over the last several years, we've seen almost no movement from the legislature on the issue. besides the legalization of hemp production and the sale and use of CBD. And according to the Marijuana Policy Project, over half of our state's population voted on marijuana-related issues in 2018. And every single one, whether it's for medical marijuana or recreational use, passed. And according to the Marquette University Law Poll in 2019, over 80% of Wisconsinites support legalization of medical marijuana. And now the medical benefits of marijuana are clear, from treating chronic pain and easing the suffering of those with cancer to treating epilepsy and other issues. So patients in our state shouldn't be criminalized for accessing the medicine that they and their doctors think is best for them. It's long past time Wisconsin joins the 33 other states that have legalized medical marijuana, and that's why in our very first budget proposal, Governor Evers proposed creating a medical marijuana program in our state. And we also know that the criminalization of marijuana possession has contributed to the shameful inequities we see in our criminal justice system. Nationally, white and black people use marijuana at comparable rates. But according to a report from the ACLU, black Wisconsinites are over 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. Simple marijuana use and possession is a victimless crime. And while mostly white business executives are making millions off marijuana sales in states where it's legal, poor black and brown people are being disproportionately imprisoned for mere possession here in Wisconsin. I've been a long-time proponent of marijuana decriminalization to help address this. And Governor Evers proposed decriminalizing small amounts of marijuana in our first budget as well. And unfortunately, Republicans in the legislature removed these provisions from the budget just as they blocked every attempt to legalize marijuana in any form in our state. So in order to see some change on these issues, we need to have lawmakers that can actually be held accountable to the people of the state. And that means we need fair legislative maps and full participation in our census. All of these issues are interrelated, so I hope you all will keep that in mind while you discuss reforms to our marijuana policies. So thank you all for your tireless advocacy and keep up the fight for a better, more just, fair, and equitable world.
And winning with marijuana in a swing state. I am Alan Robinson, the Executive Director of Wisconsin NORML. I'm joined by Rachel Steidle, the Deputy Director of Southeastern Wisconsin NORML, and Senator LaTanya Johnson. Senator Johnson introduced Senate Bill 377 into our legislature in the last legislative session that would have legalized marijuana use for responsible adults consumption. Senator Johnson, I'm wondering, so you've been winning with marijuana for a while now. Would you mind saying hello and speaking about that a little bit?
Hello, I'm Wisconsin Senator LaTanya Johnson. I represent the 6th Senate District here in Milwaukee, located on Milwaukee's north and northwest side. So we introduced this bill roughly for about 4 sessions. This bill was introduced by my predecessor, Senator Nakia Harris-Dodd, when she was elected. And for the last 2 sessions, I've been the Democratic lead. We all know that this is something that's very much needed in Wisconsin. Right now, current state law for the Wisconsin state statutes lists that a first offense is a Class A misdemeanor, which is a fine up to $1,000 and up to 6 months in prison. But every second and subsequent offense is a Class I felony with a fine up to $10,000 and up to 3.5 years in prison. So those are extremely, extremely antiquated laws, especially when we know that according to a Marquette poll in 2019, over 60% of the residents were okay with legalizing marijuana in Wisconsin. We've seen 33 states around this country, including 10 that have fully legalized marijuana, like our neighboring states, Illinois and Michigan. And they are doing phenomenal in terms of tax collections and being able to have those dollars used to assist their residents. So we all know that it's time, and not to mention the amount of money that we could save regarding drug enforcement in the state by making marijuana legal.
You touched on a lot of very key points there in regards to marijuana reform and how much we need it. I'm wondering what roadblocks you faced in the legislature, or this bill particularly has faced since you inherited it.
The majority of the roadblocks have came from our Republican counterparts. A lot of them feel like marijuana leads to other things or trying other drugs, when we know that that's just not the case. In states that have legalized marijuana, especially healthy communities, they've seen 25% lower overdose death rates in those states and a 23% decrease in opioid dependence. So getting my Republican counterparts to understand that, legalizing marijuana is one way to bring money in, especially for those communities that desperately need it, the same communities that we claim we don't have the resources available to provide care for those communities. But we all know that Black and whites use marijuana the same. But African Americans in the state of Wisconsin are 6 times more likely to be arrested in Wisconsin for marijuana use, when they're 4 times more likely to be arrested nationally. So we see upward numbers in this state of arresting African Americans for marijuana use, even higher than the national level. So that's one reason in particularly that we need to address marijuana use in the state by legalizing it.
So, marijuana is one of those issues that enjoys broad bipartisan. There you go. I was making sure I wasn't muted. It enjoys broad bipartisan support nationally. What we've experienced, and Rachel, maybe you can tell me what your experience has been in regards to dealing with specific Republicans in our legislature, because we've noticed that, with reform happening in Republican legislatures, Rachel, are there what are some things that we can do to try to help bridge the gap?
Well, definitely, I think being patient with our opposition is getting a little tiresome, but we just need to keep educating them, tell them about all the good things that marijuana can do, not only as far as creating new businesses, but it's great medicine. And the more we learn about it, the more we know it can do, from things like cancer to seizures, to now we're learning about things like mental health, like depression and PSD treatments. Really what's holding it back as far as us doing more research is that it remains illegal. You can't go to the pharmacy and get cannabis for your arthritis. Now that we have CBD and hemp, that helps a little bit, but I think for the people that are suffering the most, they need the full product. So we just got to keep working on them. There's a lot of opposition out there. There's a lot of people that so the problem is that the street corner pharmacist will sell to your kids, a dispensary and the pharmacy will not.
I say it all the time. Drug dealers don't check IDs. Bud tenders do. Senator Johnson, how do we bridge the divide?
I think that Rachel was exactly right. Education. It has been shown that if we legalize marijuana in Wisconsin, the economic benefits are enormous. Wisconsin has the opportunity to take in $138 million a year in state taxes. We're talking about $2.7 million in local taxes, and the possibility of creating 18,000 legal living wage jobs that are sustainable, jobs that our economy so desperately needs. We all have seen the effects of COVID-19, but none has seen those effects like our African American and our Latino issue of concern, because you have so many otherwise legal law-abiding citizens that are running the risk of getting that felony. And some individuals have gotten that felony. And how does that felony hinder our community? How does that lead to rising crime? How does that lead to unemployment and eviction and the inability to care for your kids? Felony offenses for marijuana possession and up to a $10,000 fine or 3 years in prison, that's definitely an antiquated law, especially when we see so many of our neighboring states legalizing marijuana. And that issue cannot be lost. If you can go across state lines to Chicago and it's legal, or across state lines the other way and it's legal in Michigan, then why are we providing felonies right here in Wisconsin? That makes absolutely no sense. We need to take a look at these laws. They need to be readdressed. They need to be changed. And even more, if we really want to have conversations, even though hemp is legal in the state, you still have repercussions for some people that are using it, whether that's family drug court and people losing their sobriety days because there are no enforced standards around how the product is manufactured and distributed. That's something else that needs to be addressed. In Wisconsin, we tend to do things, as my grandmother would say, half-assed, and not get to the core of what should be addressed and what should be done. So we need to make sure that we are not over penalizing people in Wisconsin simply because they live in the wrong state. And for some of those people being over penalized, there are a lot of those individuals that look like me. They use marijuana at the same rate as their white counterparts, but yet they're 6 times more likely to be arrested, and that's the issue.
Just to kind of follow up with that, Black lives matter, right? And that's something that we have been cognizant of this summer, right? If Black lives matter, then Black livelihood matters. And now, the fact of the matter is that for the I'm probably going to talk for a minute, Rachel, so you might want to pass the pen over.
Gotcha. That's funny. If I want to steal the mic, I definitely want to. Sorry, what was that?
Well, let me finish my thought here.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. So from the years that we have the closest statistics for, and that would be from 2018 to 2019, it would seem as if cannabis was, there were 663,000 plus arrests for cannabis related offense, right? Over that same period of time, cannabis generated $22 billion in revenue in legally regulated states. Now, 97% of the legally owned cannabis industry is owned by white males, 99% by white people, right? My question in regards to that is, and I just want to put this into perspective for you. The largest police department on the planet has an annual revenue or annual budget of $6 billion. So legal cannabis generated a fortune big enough to fuel the New York City Police Department for 3 years with a multi-billion-dollar fortune left over. And the ACLU tells us that the vast majority of the people that were arrested for a cannabis-related offense looked like, well, Black and brown people. So I'm wondering, are there any strategies that that people can employ to that legislators can employ when they're drafting legislation that's going to make it more equitable for minorities to get into the industry?
And that's a good question. All of that has to do with regulation and surrounding regulation in agriculture. And these are discussions that we've had both in the Black Caucus and the Black and Latina Caucus and in the Capitol just in general. And what that legislation would look like, I don't know. We are constantly told, even by individuals who own hemp stores, that their number one issue is banking and not being able to find banks that are willing to take that chance on their business because of so many other issues, concern for maybe dealing in marijuana or drugs or whatever. So I don't know what the answer is to make that more equitable. I know that there are numerous vacant buildings right here in the state of Wisconsin, especially big box stores that I would love to see redeveloped. And I would love to see city agriculture with marijuana or hemp as a base to be able to provide local jobs right here in the community. And I'm sure that a lot of other communities would welcome that too, if given the opportunity. But we definitely have to find a way to bring jobs into communities that look like ours, those that are hardest hit, especially when so many of your traditional jobs don't want to make the investment in these communities, either because of their poverty or their dilapidation, or, them feeling that some of these neighborhoods have high crime rates. We have to find new ways to bring new industry into these communities that are willing to be a part. And so many of our traditional employers have not stepped up to the plate to do that. I had an opportunity a couple of times this month to help provide food for our low income and our poor families. And the struggle is real, but not only the types of struggle. I had the opportunity to help give out food at a drive-up food bank. And what I saw there was extremely interesting, that, you had a lot of cars that were on their last leg. You could tell that people were really suffering. But we had Lexus, we had Corvettes, we had Mercedes, newer models that were pulling up into these food lines. So that says that the hurt that we're experiencing is across the board. And any mechanism that we can use to get jobs into these communities, especially family sustaining jobs, is welcomed. And so legislation around how we make that more equitable, I don't have a real answer for that, but I know that our communities are in desperate need of jobs and resources.
Well,
Definitely.
Yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, no, I agree. I actually live in a neighborhood in Milwaukee called Halyard Park, where we definitely could use some re-energization. We definitely need jobs that sustain a family, pay that living wage. We know that cannabis could be our opportunity. It's great for stores in the city and all those dairy farms in the country. Anything to give people some opportunities so they can empower themselves would definitely be much needed. Another concern that people have is that we want to see diversity in the people that are growing and working at those stores. We're worried that it's going to become a big cannabis industry, as in you're going to have multi-millions. A lot of people worry about that. It's called vertical integration, because not everybody can afford to do it from seed to sale at the store. So definitely teamwork makes the dream work. If we could get a lot of people set up to network with their small businesses, we'd have much stronger communities.
Yeah.
You bring up some really interesting points in regards to employers. One of our employers here in Dane County, the sheriff of our county, actually, I had a meeting with him, and he told me that his officers too would like to have access to cannabis and those sorts of medications, right? Well, CBD as a medication, Senator Johnson. Now, what I was advised of is that they have a zero tolerance policy. If they're using CBD and they're taking that, can they? We know it's possible that they can get a positive test for THC, right?
Could be. Not supposed to be, but could be.
I saw in family court, I had the opportunity to visit family court. I saw a mom lose her sobriety days because of traces in her urine, because they have to randomly drop. And it was argued, they have a team of about maybe 35 to 50 people that talk about these cases before the women are brought in or before the parents are brought in. And so family court is a drug treatment court. These people have lost custody of their kids. They go through the family court or the drug treatment court in order to regain custody of their children. And one of the conversations was, one of the individuals in there, one of the doctors or the social worker said they believe the mom. And they had this conversation with the judge that they believe the mom, that, she went from using drugs on a daily basis to using what is now legal cannabis, not cannabis, but hemp products or whatever. And so she was using that every day. And so the social worker and the doctors were having these discussions, and they said it depended on where she got her product from. If she bought from a reputable dealer, then those were safeguards that, that the amount that is legally supposed to be in the product, I think is something like 0.03 or yeah, then there would be no problem. But if the product was bought from your local gas station, if the product wasn't manufactured in a way that was conducive to allowing that metrics to be met, then yes, you're going to find traces in the blood, in the urine or in the test, and they may be significantly higher. So I watched her lose her sobriety days, and the way that mom broke down and cried, you knew that she was not trying to do anything to set her back. The judge had a conversation with her and said, look, I believe you. He said, your sobriety days isn't the only way to regain custody of your kids. There are a lot of metrics that you can meet. He said, but because you have to take a random drug test often, this is not something that we advise you to do. And, the conversation before that mom came in about her case was, if she was any other person on the street that didn't have to subject to random drug tests frequently, she may have been fine. But because she was in family court, and probably because of where she bought her product from, she was going to be penalized. And to be, in all honesty, that's the state of Wisconsin's fault. Because
just a second. I'm sorry, go ahead. Well, I kind of want to stay on the topic of criminal justice in as far as cannabis is concerned when it comes to DUIs, right? Because we met with the Attorney General, Josh Call. Good guy. Josh Call told us, Attorney General Call said that while he would like to see, this was a statement he released the day after we met with him. He said that he would like to see departments' resources taken away from cannabis reform or cannabis prohibition prosecutions and more towards more difficult drugs such as meth, heroin, etc. But he also made the note about keeping our roads safe. Now, currently in Wisconsin, if you get pulled over and you have a blood draw, or if you're in a car accident or anything like that, you have a blood draw and you have THC in your system, you are guilty of a DUI. According to the NTSB, There is absolutely no link between having blood or THC in your bloodstream and being impaired, um, because you can have THC in your system for up to 30 days. So with minefields like this, do you find the obstruction coming from the Republican Party to, because essentially they're stopping us from being able to research THC and research our scientists from being able to dig in and find out what the links are between the impairment so that we can give law enforcement a leg up. I mean, do you just want to comment at all on how at all we could possibly defeat this sort of obstructionism when it's access that is going to help law enforcement access to the research and access to these drugs? Like, when it's law enforcement then on one hand saying, well, we can't do anything, it seems as if we're in a circle of chasing our tails, and the people are who are getting hurt. So if you just want to kind of speak to how we can help law enforcement, and how we can also protect our roads, any of those things, that'd be great.
I think the research is the key. Research is the key. Having uniform standards is the key. Having manufacturing guidelines, real guidelines for individuals to follow, all of that is key. Because if you have people who are being penalized for the most simplest of things, then we have to find a way through that. And that's to make sure that the research is there, that the standards are there. And without those standards, without that uniformity, you're going to keep getting what you get. If it's going to be an enforceable mechanism, then we need to know, why is it being enforced? How is it being effective? How are people being effective? And maybe, those blood draws aren't necessarily the key in terms of those specific drugs. Maybe there needs to be something else. I don't know what that is, but definitely uniformity is the key, because you want to make sure that we are not penalizing people needlessly. We have too much of that already.
Absolutely. And there's terrible injustices, just like you told us about your particular constituent. Definitely it's across the board for many different reasons. But we want to get to the end. We want to know what our next steps, what can we do to win with marijuana in Wisconsin here? What can we do to push this bill forward?
Contact your electeds, and not just the electeds in your community. Sometimes, that's the biggest myth. Contact your elected, and your elected may be on board. You need to contact other electeds as well. The state legislature needs to hear from you. If people are in my district and they're only calling me, well, then I get to hear your voice, but nobody else does. It doesn't matter if you live in that individual's district or not. They represent the state of Wisconsin. So call your electeds, but call other electeds too. Let them know that this is an important issue for you, from Democrats to Republican. If you have to go down the list, make those phone calls, send those emails out, let people hear your voice. We have to have that in order to make a decision determining this. If I only get 50 contacts in my office around marijuana and legalization, I might say, that's not such a big deal. But if it's 150,000 contacts or 10 or 20,000 contacts, then I'm paying attention. And so it's important that you contact all of the members of the state legislature and let them know where you stand and that you want to see this bill passed. This is your state. And ultimately, for those individuals who are going to receive those felonies and those infractions from, just wanting to participate in something that's legal on both sides of our boundaries, we need to hear from you. We need to hear how this will help, how this will impact your life. And nothing says that more than a phone call or email or a letter. We need to have that come into our offices to let us know that this is an issue that you care about and something that you want to see done.
Absolutely. I think that's great advice. Make your voice heard. It's easier than ever now that we're kind of still somewhat quarantined. Make those calls. You can get the list and reach out.
Senator Johnson, leadership is clearly an important part. Like having the bully pulpit is an important part of politics, and it certainly appears as if that has been the case here in Wisconsin. Senator Fitzgerald said that he did not see enough support in the Senate for marijuana reform in the last session. That is, of course, after half of Wisconsin had the opportunity to voice their opinion on marijuana reform, and there was overwhelming support. And a Democrat nominee who is also not great on marijuana reform. From a national standpoint, can you talk about how a patchwork of policy is affecting, different communities, and if there's going to be any changes to potential, at this point, I suppose, nominee Biden or Democratic nominee Biden's stance on policies?
Politics is a fickle is a fickle career. I'll put it like that. You can come into office with one mindset, but talking to your constituents, hearing their voices, hearing their issues can change that. Especially if you are elected by the people like all of us are. And if the majority of people say that they want something, then that's totally different. So on election day, we all go to the polls and cast our ballots, right? And just like with the referendum and things like that we saw overwhelming support. Now imagine if each one of those individuals sent an email or or made a phone call or sent a letter. How much more apt Republicans or anybody else that's an elected individual would be to change their mind. Because now you have tangible evidence that your constituents want something. And let me be clear. It takes a lot of effort for people to sit down and send an email or to send a letter, because that means they're taking 10, 15, 20 minutes out of their day to voice their concern in black and white and on paper. The same with a phone call. So when those contacts and those voices start coming into our office, especially when they start coming in volume, we pay attention to that. We pay attention when there are our own constituents, because we know that those voices can turn into votes, either for myself or for somebody else. But we pay extreme amounts of attention when they're not just sending it to you, they're sending it to everybody, because then they've taken the extra effort to go the extra mile, and you know that they are serious. And so I think that that's the difference. President Biden could come into office one day, and with overwhelming contact and support, he could easily change his mind. Any elected official can. That's why people hire lobbyists, because they put money behind their mission to go out and make those contacts, make those relationships, to let people know that they're serious about an issue. Sometimes everyday ordinary people, we don't have lobbyists, right? So we have to do that work ourselves. So if we get in, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 emails, particularly on a topic, we pay attention. When if she say not many, it's nobody's reached out to my office. But if you say, I've gotten like 400, 500 or more, then people pay attention. And that's what we need people to do. We need our elected officials to pay attention, but that's only going to happen if people start making their voices known, if they go that extra mile to let their legislatures know this is an important issue. And the same goes at the federal level too. For those people who want to see things change, they have to make that shift themselves. They have to reach out and let us know that this is important to them.
Definitely, and that's excellent. You've got to hear it and hear it again. Don't think that your neighbor calling for you does it for the whole block. Call today, call tomorrow. I think that's definitely good advice. It sounds like we have we know that it's time to legalize it. Is there anything that could, I guess a lot of people that are opposed, they say, well, things could go wrong. Other than the misconceptions, is there anything really to stop us now? I don't really think there's any good reasons to hold us back. So do you know of any?
You know, if I thought that there were major concerns about doing this, or if I thought that this was going to hurt my community, there's no way that I would be for this. But right now, I see the disparities in our Black and brown communities being so large that the only way to address this is through financial resources, which marijuana sales and the legalization could bring in. When you look at the things that can be addressed from the legalization of marijuana and the income, the potential income to bring in, and then if we use those resources to reinvest in those neighbor communities that are most vulnerable, it's a win-win. There's no way that I would be here. There's no way that my name would be on this bill if I thought it was going to hurt my community. I wouldn't do that. But from where I sit, I see absolutely nothing to stand in our way from our ability to do this and to stop disenfranchising so many people that have been hurt already.
You know, Senator Johnson, I got to tell you, I think that the harm done to your community, my community, our community, is coming from the prohibition of cannabis. Let's not forget for 1 second that marijuana prohibition in the United States of America was instigated for racist reasons and to ensure a white supremacy racist sort of culture by a gentleman by the name of Harry Anslinger. This was years and years and years ago, before you were conceived, Senator Johnson. Like, I thought about it for a second, and I thought, that's Senator Johnson is one of my contemporaries. Like, well before us. So we can't get far away from forgetting the very fact that marijuana prohibition in and of itself is racist policy. It's policy that doesn't make sense from a medical standpoint. It is policy that was put in place to hurt our communities. And I believe personally that the only thing that is stopping us from getting it done is our ability to coalesce behind the shared goal of instituting cannabis reform in an equitable way. But that's just me. Well, I don't have any further questions for you, Senator Johnson. Rachel, do you?
I feel like we've had a great conversation. We've really gotten to the bottom of our issue here. So I think we're doing good.
It was a great conversation. Senator Johnson, do you have any closing remarks that you would like to impart on the folks that want to win with marijuana in their swing state?
I don't. I just want to say thank you for this conversation, especially this conversation on such an important issue. From where I sit and from the decisions that I make, there's no reason why we should be giving individuals felonies for second offenses in terms of marijuana. Marijuana is a win-win. The resources that it's going to bring in, I cannot tout enough. I think the ACLU said that we would be able to save $44.3 million a year in taxpayer money through legalization of marijuana, due to the elimination of drug enforcement and the money that's spent on drug enforcement. So without a shadow of a doubt, anything that we can do to help bring some equity to our Black and Brown communities, we should do, but also fairness too. We want our communities to thrive regardless of where they are. And in my opinion, these antiquated bills or laws just make that inequity just that more prevalent. So thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. And I hope the individuals that we are speaking to reach out, and they continue to reach out, and they get more people to reach out to the state legislature so we can see this bill enacted one day.
Well, thank you for joining us for this conversation. It was great to have you to talk about your bill.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's all she wrote. Have a nice rest of your day, weekend, whatever it is for you, Senator Johnson.
Thank you.
All right, now, signing out. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the panel on winning with marijuana in a swing state. This is our live Q&A. I am Alan Robinson, the executive director of Wisconsin NORML. I'm joined by Senator-elect, well, I'll tell you, the Senate District 26 is heavily gerrymandered, so it's a Democratic district. Kelda Roys won that primary and emerged as essentially the senator-elect. So I'm joined by her and the deputy director of Southeastern Wisconsin NORML, Rachel Steidel. She's going to get us started off with our first question. So I'll kick it over to Rachel.
For sure. Our first question is, what should advocates in other swing states prioritize when it comes to approaching lawmakers about cannabis legalization and decriminalization? I kind of see two parts with that one. I definitely think you got to make sure your lawmakers are clear on what the differences are between legalization and decriminalization, because you can still get in trouble with decriminalization, and that's better than totally not allowed, which some places in Wisconsin still have, versus where I live in Milwaukee, where it's decriminalized. And then I think what advocates should know when they're approaching lawmakers is to focus on the positive. Yeah, of course, there's some risk of addiction, but it's very low. And that means the majority of people have positive experiences. I'll pass it over to Kelda.
Thanks so much, Rachel. It's great to be with you all. Mental health, and make sure that whether it's going to be most about the budgetary impact. If there's someone who's in a district that's been hard hit by the opioid epidemic, you're going to focus on the link between legalization of cannabis. Many wonderful reasons why we should be supporting legalization that you really can choose from, 20 different arguments that are all persuasive, but each one is going to be important to a different legislator. Like each of us is going to have listening to the decision maker, the legislators that you want to target, figuring out how they make their decisions, who do they listen to, what arguments are most persuasive for them, what other similar kinds already wanted to pass other kinds of criminal justice reforms. Maybe there's someone who is concerned about, Black Lives Matter in your legislators, and really target your arguments specifically.
Yeah. As the vice president and her being a lead sponsor on the MORE Act, it's really important to take into consideration the way state law is going to be rolled out. So with the MORE Act, there's a provision in there that every state that is prohibiting cannabis it encourages them to stop doing that by withholding tax dollars. So there's a mechanism in there that would encourage the repeal of cannabis law prohibition for those states. So I would think that it's going to be important to prioritize not only some equity in the decriminalization aspect, and as far as expungements goes on a state level, but it would also then be imperative to incorporate equity in the economic structure of whatever cannabis law is going to be instituted in your state. Otherwise, I think that you're going to find your state legislature going back and retool in November and maybes. But politics is speculation, right? On just perspective, how they're what they need from cannabis.
States that the concerns that people have around here make them really going on with that.
A lot of more liberal. I think running late is a governors and blue senators and district. I had people saying that they were not for legalization.
State, and if going into the yeah, you have been a rock star in this whole thing. Thank you.
Yeah, here.
So SSDP is a movement of 5,000 young people who are organizing our peers all over the world to change the legal status of drugs and learn how to be badass activists in the process.
And I didn't realize the war on drugs failed me until my freshman year when I joined SSDP, and I remember learning the term, the war on drugs, and then followed by harm reduction.
You know how they say that there's at least 7 people on this planet that are exactly like you? I think in the past 6 hours I've met more than 7 people who've had very different experiences in life but have resulted in the same outcomes, which is being here at SSDP today.
As soon as I got to SSDP 2019, I was just overwhelmed with positivity and compassion. The energy here is at such a high frequency that you just can't even imagine it without being here yourself.
Really thankful to this organization for just helping me become more of a professional when talking to, local decision makers and people who shape policy all over the world today.
We wouldn't be able to offer valuable resources to our students and train them and educate them without the help of our supporters and Sensible Society members.
I've made so many different connections from just attending this conference that I truly feel confident in my research endeavors, in my endeavors as a chapter leader, and every other pursuit that I have with my chapter and those who are in my chapter.
Hi everyone, my name is Rachel Steidel from southeastern Wisconsin Normal. It is my pleasure to introduce Melissa Sargent. She is the Assembly Rep for the 48th District of Wisconsin. She is also a champion of marijuana legalization. We are so grateful that she is able to join us today.
Hi there, this is State Representative Melissa Sargent, and I am so pleased and honored to have been invited to spend a little bit of time with you today. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for all of their time and effort in making this happen. It's not easy. And I would like to thank each of you for taking time out of your days to be able to join us. Well, I certainly would much rather be with you face to face. unfortunately, we are in the middle of a global pandemic. And the reality is that it is much safer for all of us to be communicating and finding our advocacy voices in a new way. And thank goodness for technology. So I am the proud sponsor of a bill in Wisconsin that would fully legalize cannabis for adult recreational use as well as for medicinal use. Since my first term in the legislature as a state assembly representative in the 48th district, which encompasses parts of Madison, the north and east sides, I have been proud to introduce and to author this really important piece of legislation. When I first ran for office, I did not do it thinking that I was going to be the person that introduced a full adult rec bill in the state of Wisconsin. But let me tell you, when I was knocking on doors as a candidate, when I was doing listening sessions as a candidate, and then after I was elected and had office hours, it was really clear to me, based on the conversations that I had with countless people from all across the state of Wisconsin, that the most dangerous thing about cannabis in Wisconsin is that it is illegal, and that we needed to do something to address that. Now, legalizing cannabis isn't as easy as just saying, okay, here we're gonna legalize. There is a lot of thought and effort, a lot of conversations that had to take place in order for this bill to be drafted. And each legislative session, since the first one that we introduced the bill, we have modified the bill slightly based on the conversations that we have had with people all across the great state of Wisconsin, as well as conversations that we've had with people in other states that have taken the steps to legalize cannabis. It is really important to me that we are pragmatic about this legislation, that we do realize that we need to provide protections for our community in this policy, but that not having this conversation, that the prohibition of cannabis is actually more damaging and more harmful to Wisconsin. So what we have is a bill that's over 100 pages long that addresses many of the concerns that folks have about legalization. We need to make sure that we're keeping our kids safe and that we're keeping our communities safe. We need to make sure that people who are using cannabis have access to a product that is safe, that doesn't have mold, that doesn't have pesticides, and that people know what it is exactly that they're ingesting. Additionally, we need to make sure in this policy that we are addressing the social justice aspects that come along with legalization. In Wisconsin, we know that people of color are between 4 and 7 times more likely to be arrested for simple possession of this plant than white folks, and that's egregious. We know that usage between folks across the state of Wisconsin is pretty much the same. So how do we address these racial disparities? Part of it is by legalizing. Additionally, we need to make sure that we're providing a path forward for people that have been harmed by these policies. And that would be included in the bill that I have authored as well. Allowing people who do have nonviolent cannabis-related offenses the ability to have their records expunged, as well as people that are currently in the criminal justice system, in our jails and prisons, and who are under supervision, the ability to petition to be released from supervision or from jail or prison. Additionally, we need to make sure that we have an educational component and that we allow for our communities, our local communities, to be able to address this, the legalization. We are seeing that Wisconsin in the Midwest is an island of prohibition. Once again, as with many other policies, we are finding ourselves surrounded by states that are much more progressive when it comes to this policy. I know that the only place that cannabis legalization is partisan is in the Capitol building in Madison. I know that folks in rural and urban Wisconsin, I know that people of color and white folks, I know people who vote for presidents that are Democrat as well as Republican that fully support the legalization of cannabis. And that is why I have been so outspoken about this policy and why I've been a champion of it and for it. And I am not going to be done. I know that this is something that is important to very many people, that we could be investing in saving our family farms. Unfortunately, in Wisconsin right now, we're seeing roughly 2 farms a day shutter their doors. That's our legacy. And I know that with the legalization of cannabis, that we can provide new opportunities for prosperity for our farming communities. We can address the racial justice and criminal justice system in Wisconsin. We can be providing tax revenue to be investing in our schools and in our mental health systems and substance abuse. We can be saving money by legalizing. We can be saving time for our first responders to actually be focusing on systems and problems within their communities, as opposed to addressing people who are using this plant. And I know that we can do this without $1 going as a corporate tax giveaway, as has been the case with so many other economic stimulus packages that Wisconsin has offered over the last handful of years. We can be creating jobs. We can be addressing our egregious racial disparities. We can be reforming our criminal justice system. We can be bringing in tax revenue. We can be educating our kids. And that's just a handful of the reasons why it is that I know that the most dangerous thing about cannabis in Wisconsin is that it is illegal. This is a policy that we are going to be able to change, but it's dependent on the grassroots. And here we are in an election year. Make this be something that you are talking to folks who are running for office to answer to. And let's hold people accountable as well after the elections in November and as we move into a new legislative cycle here in Wisconsin in January. Because I think that you and I, and we all can agree that the most dangerous thing about cannabis in Wisconsin is that it remains illegal. Thank you.
When we started the summit, we had the vision to create a platform to convene unlikely allies to exchange ideas on cannabis policy reform. We may not all agree on everything, but something it's important to highlight our common ground on the issues that we do agree on. And with cannabis, we have ample opportunity to do that. I hope you enjoyed the discussions today, and I hope you leave here armed with more knowledge and a broader network.
Hello, my name is Erica Dara. I'm on the board of directors for Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and I'm also an organizer with Sunrise Movement. This panel is titled The Intersection of Drug Policy Reform and Climate Justice, and the purpose of this panel is to explain how drug prohibition and environmental racism are forms of structural violence against people of color in the United States. The toll of environmental racism and economic disparity on communities of color has been painfully apparent during the pandemic crisis, with death rates being significantly higher for non-white people. Climate activists and abolitionists alike believe that we have to transform our entire society in order to save the planet and our humanity. Structural and systemic problems require solutions of comparable scale, and this panel intends to explain how addressing climate injustice and ending the war on drugs are a step toward a brighter future. Hi everyone, my name is Erica Dara. I'm on the board of directors for Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and I'm also an organizer with Sunrise Movement.
And my name is Jason Ortiz. I am the president of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, and I'm also a Puerto Rican activist that fights for the justice for Puerto Rican people.
Hi everyone, my name is Joshua Alvarez. I'm an organizer with Sunrise Movement in DC, and also an organizer with Mi Gente, organizing for Latinx folks.
Hey, welcome. So thank you so much for participating in this panel. So to get started, we'll just define climate justice for the folks who might not be familiar with the term. So climate justice is the fair treatment of all people and the freedom from discrimination in the policies and projects that address climate change, as well as the systems that create climate change and perpetuate discrimination. And to kind of like ground that in human experience, we kind of start with some storytelling, and Jason, would you like to share?
Sure. So, this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart as a Puerto Rican that was also arrested at a very young age, like criminal justice and how the system decides to oppress us has been very dear to me as something I've had to deal with from, I was very little. And so it was when I was 16 years old, I was in high school, I just turned 16, and I was arrested for smoking cannabis on the way to school. And the police came to school and arrested us and made a big, scene out of it. I was thrown out of school for the second half of the school year. And so at 16 years old, being pulled away from all my support systems was devastating. And I had to figure out how to really readjust my entire life, let alone then having to enter the criminal justice system and deal with courts and all of these other processes that I didn't really understand at the time. But I was lucky I had a strong familial background. My mom was very supportive of what happened and helping me kind of move through it. And so during that time, I was able to look up a lot of different pieces of information about laws. And as a 16-year-old, I didn't really know exactly what was happening to me, but I did find the term the war on drugs. And along with that, the school to prison pipeline and selective enforcement. And so while I was not in school, I did learn some really important things about how law operates in society. And that it wasn't just that, or it wasn't that Jason Ortiz made some big mistake that was hurting lots of people, but that there was an entire system in place to control folks that did certain behaviors that some people thought were not acceptable. And so, that experience definitely showed me that not all laws are just, and I became an activist around cannabis justice and just in general ending the war on drugs. And then I was lucky enough to go to the University of Connecticut. And the only reason I was able to go to the University of Connecticut and join organizations like SSDP was because there was a change in a very specific piece of legislation called the Higher Education Act's Federal Aid Elimination Penalty. And that very long title, man, anyone arrested for cannabis in high school couldn't get financial aid to go to college. And so I was one of those people. And in the time between I was arrested and I was able to apply for school, folks changed that law. And SSDP and other organizations work to do that. So it's both negatively impacted by the war on drugs, but also positively impacted by the movement to end the war on drugs. And so ever since I had figured that out, and I joined SSDP, and I've been trying to change those laws across the country. For MCBA, it's been an uphill battle as far as cannabis laws go. But I do think it's important that when we think about the war on drugs and just how these laws affect us, that we expand the scope out and look at the different intersections of different movements. And so I'm really excited to not just talk about drug policy today, but also climate justice and how they're all connected.
Oh, thanks for sharing that, Jason. I resonate because I grew up in Dallas, Texas, in a working class community, predominantly Black and brown folks, a lot of immigrants, and that was in the east part of Dallas. But I would take a school bus to go to the west side, to West Dallas, which is where I went to school at the Dallas Environmental Science Academy, which is really where I learned about environmentalism, and I think that's really where I was more radicalized at, like the importance of climate justice. But going to that school, what I saw is that community, which is where my grandpa currently has been living most of his life. It's been an over-policed community. A lot of folks, even in my school, right, is like ended up in circumstances like going to jail, right, is like being targeted, going into that pipeline. One of the exceptions who I got to go to get scholarships, continue on my journey. But I saw how a lot of my friends were impacted, like how the way that you were. But then that same community, like what's interesting is because it's a predominantly Black and brown community, there are a lot of factories there that actually polluted the land. So there's a lot of there are high asthma rates. Like even my grandpa recently, he's been having a lot of health problems because of all that. And then the additional layer of him not having health insurance, right, which now has put him in this burden of being in debt. He's almost 70 years old. So it's just you can see the connections of all these issues and just how folks like you and I, right, have been impacted.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, I resonate with what you said about how the different sides of the same city can be so different in the way that the systems interact together. Yeah. So yeah, thank you both so much for your stories. And to start us off, I wanted to start with referencing something that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez really it was news already, but it kind of propelled it into the headlines, this idea that environmental racism is a pre-existing condition that makes Black and brown people more vulnerable to COVID and death related to COVID. And so various studies have confirmed this, and there's data from Brookings that says for people age 45 to 54, or the Black and Latino community death rates are like 6 times higher than they are for white people, and that's supposed to be like the less risky category, right? So like when you get to like the actual high risk category, it's like astronomical how big of a difference there is. And so I kind of wanted to start with talking about like what some factors you think could be related to this. You both already kind of mentioned some of them, but if you wanted to be more explicit. Sure.
Yeah, I think I touched on the biggest one that I see is right, like that lack of access to healthcare. Right now there is no universal healthcare for a lot of folks here, and even if they do, it's like doesn't always cover everything that they need, and they end up in burden, like in under a lot of like in the burden of like having to take out loans to pay for those things. So it's just the whole system isn't functioning for anybody. And then in addition to that, right, it's like a lot of folks who are considered essential workers, right, are working class, predominantly Black and brown folks. And these companies exploit them, right? Even undocumented folks, right? It's like they have to still go into work because they depend on their paychecks to be able to survive. And then food deserts too, right? It's like there are a lot of folks who can't get access to fresh fruits, fresh vegetables. I was like, there's like one grocery store, right? Like for example, here in DC and in the South Side, which is the predominantly Black community, there's only one place where people can buy food. So yeah, those are some of the ways that I see it.
Absolutely, thank you so much. And you mentioned the like relationship between pollution, air pollution especially, and the fact that like COVID is starts out as a respiratory illness, and so many people just start like from the baseline more vulnerable. Yeah, I wonder, Jason, did you have anything you'd like to share on that?
Yeah, I think your point about folks being baseline more vulnerable is what is at the core of a lot of this, right? I mean, class issues and your ability to purchase healthcare or other types of resources is going to be, directly impacting all kinds of things. And so healthcare is incredibly expensive, right? And part of the reason it's incredibly expensive is because we privatized healthcare and made insurance companies come in and try to make lots of money. And, it makes it impossible for folks that are struggling financially to just have their basic needs met. So that means whenever there's a crisis, it's always going to affect the poor and people of color dramatically more than the wealthy. And so when we start to compound crises and put them on top of each other is when we really start to see dramatic difficulties just for entire communities. And so we're going to see that in healthcare. We're going to see that when it comes to folks wanting to be able to support families. And we're going to see it when we start to see our sea levels rise, and island nations are going to see their land, destroyed first, and wealthy folks will be able to move to, higher ground or farther inland while they just leave everybody else to dry. And so like when I think of the nation of Puerto Rico, my people, right, we see it there dramatically so that they want to put big coal plants and dump coal ash on the island. And so Applied Energy Systems is an electric company that has been controlling a lot of coal-powered fire plants on the island. And there have been people protesting to get these coal ashes off of the island for decades. And just, a few years ago, a hurricane hit. And so if you have a 10-foot tall pile of ash that's just spread out over miles, as soon as you have any kind of hurricane, it's going to blast it all over the island, right? And so who's that going to affect? Folks that acute small changes in their environment will be really devastating. Poor folks, the elderly. And of course, this isn't an accident, right? Like they want to move these folks out so that they can sell that land for high dollars, right? Even though it's like really dangerous land to build on the coast right now, they'll sell it to somebody because they don't care, who they sell it to either. And so we're seeing just like one crisis after another. We're seeing a healthcare crisis, a climate crisis, and a democratic crisis in Puerto Rico right now too, where it's making it impossible to even vote corrupt politicians out when they're claiming they just didn't have enough ballots for the election, right? Like that's a really difficult situation to put in. So when we consider that there's peoples of color all throughout the country in these different communities facing multiple crises at any given time, whenever we add to that, it can be backbreaking for folks. And so that's why I think it's super important that we don't look at this like everybody's starting from the same point in the middle of a crisis, right? We're all at different levels, and some people just have a much farther head start to getting what they need than communities of color will.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's a lot to consider, especially for island nations. There's a statistic that says that the poorest people in the world are the ones who have done the least to contribute to climate change, but they will be the first and the most severely impacted by its disasters. And then there's the compounding crisis of the climate refugees that's already happening around the world as different places become uninhabitable or dangerous. Okay, so when these like patterns, we've talked a lot, we've already heard a lot about these like patterns that exist in our society. And often when like politicians are confronted with these systemic issues, they'll like blame it on an individual, or like, you know, like they just didn't try, or like why did they make those choices in their life? And but the scale of this seems like this is inequality is structural, right? It's like embedded in everything about our society. And so are there any regulations or laws that reinforce racial disparity, especially as it relates to environmental policy and some levels of drug policy? I mean, I'm aware, like most, so as drug policy reformers, we're aware of like the big ones, but is there, or I guess, would you like to share it, Jason? Go ahead.
Sure. So, I mean, I think as we think about what happens when people start to speak up, right? And so a lot of these problems aren't coming out of left field if you're talking to the communities that are affected, right? Like they've been saying, help, this is going to be a problem for a very long time. And the question of what does the government do when those concerns are raised is part and parcel why we're now talking about defunding the police on a broader scale. Because what's happening is communities will raise concerns and then the government will try to silence them or make sure that those concerns are not addressed. That eventually leads to protests and disruption, and then the police come in and make sure that movements are crushed. And we've seen this happen throughout the eras, both in the labor movement, the civil rights movement, and on and on. It's been one continuous decision to try to disrupt movements rather than actually do the right thing and help people. And this moment is going to be no different. I think what is slightly different in this moment is that we are addressing the roots of policing in the United States and globally, and whether or not it actually serves the purposes of the people. If it seems like we only interact with those institutions when we're raising concerns or trying to help our community, is that really the best thing that we want to see happen in our communities, right? And so now if we take this to the global level, because climate change is a global issue, right? And like people will be polluting all over the world, and we have to figure this out on a global level. Imperialism has been creating and laying the foundation for climate change and climate injustice for hundreds of years. And so, climate racism has been happening since we were destroying Latin American rainforests and tried to, eradicate the coca plants that were going on in Colombia under Plan Colombia. And so I think if there's folks want to look at a really clear example of U.S. drug policy wiping out and destroying the natural environment, they should look at Plan Colombia, because it's a very well-documented situation. But that is just one example of what our drug policy has been doing around the country and around the world. And so if we can understand that defunding the police is not an effort to make anyone less safe, it's an effort to redistribute resources to where they can be most effective. Pulling back our national or international foreign policy as regards to being the police officer for the world, and what we're doing on a similar level to different communities and redistributing those resources back to those communities in a way to provide things like healthcare, I think we can start to understand how all of these different issues are connected in both our local criminalization policies, our state policies, and also the way we approach foreign policy are all rooted in this idea that punishing people is what the government should be doing as a way to control the population rather than supporting folks and providing the necessities for people to be successful. And so I think we're seeing a shift here, unfortunately, for the most difficult reasons why the conversation is shifting now in the United States. But we will see a similar situation happen when, like in Puerto Rico, we have a hurricane and the federal government does nothing to help anyone and actually made the problem a lot worse. And so we're going to see this happen everywhere else. And I think we'll start to see a defunding of imperialism conversation spread, and that will include drug policy.
Absolutely. Josh, is there anything like that?
Yeah, I'm glad you're talking about imperialism. There's an example that I've actually been learning about that I think highlights the intersections of how polluters intentionally target impoverished communities the most, right? It's like Black and brown communities. I was working on Shahid Buttar's congressional campaign in San Francisco. He's trying to unseat Nancy Pelosi. And one thing that I learned while being on his campaign is that there's a community called Hunters Point, which is a predominantly Black community. And this community right now is filing a lawsuit against the city because the city is allowing for this development company to come in and clean up a land that's right next to the community, which is a Navy shipyard, which is where they tested the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan. So all those toxins, all that has been left in the land, and now this company has been coming in. They supposedly tested the land. They claimed that it was safe, but it turned out that they falsified all this information. So they've been clearing out the land, and all these toxins are being released into the air and going into the community, and so these people are breathing this. So now they're seeing like high rates of cancer, really impacting negatively, their health. And so now this community has been organizing together and trying to file this lawsuit against this company, and in the city and everybody else who has played a role in this. Because you can see is like if communities don't organize it, they don't have a way to advocate for themselves. These people, they'll just take advantage of them. So yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And so in both of your responses, there were like clear examples of harm from both action and harm from inaction, right? And so on the drug policy side, harm from action is like over policing, and harm from inaction is like a complete like lack of response to the opioid overdose crisis. And especially when people were just dying, and the government and to this day, there are states that, in response to the opioid crisis, passed laws that criminalized like the people who were the person who sold that person the drugs, which makes people much less likely to report any kind of suspected overdose, right? And then on the environmental policy side, we have our harm through action, like repealing the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, and then harm through inaction, right, where like the regulators just don't enforce the laws that exist, and if they do enforce them selectively, and the people who are least represented that are being targeted by these corporations are like just completely unprotected, even by policies that could be enforced in other places. And so like all of that said, like, and this harm through inactions was especially apparent like throughout the pandemic, and all this pressure like built up during quarantine and erupted in June when this uprising for racial justice began. And it seems that like it could be argued that like the movement is for racial justice, and drug policy reform and climate justice are part of that larger movement. And so could you talk a little bit about like what this political moment means for your respective movements, drug policy and climate justice? I'd like to jump in.
Sure, I'll take that one because mine is pretty directly related. And so as the president of a cannabis organization, especially one focused on people of color, the issue of police in our communities has never been an easy conversation or one that we shied away from. Obviously, my experience has been negative through and through whenever I interact with law enforcement. But we are a business association, so we had folks that were concerned about their businesses being looted and things like that. And so while we knew that uprisings can create friction and tension, we have also been in existence as an organization because the drug policy movement has not done a great job of actually following through on making sure racial justice is the center point of policies. They talk about it a lot, but when it comes to actually putting it into law, it's been incredibly lacking. And so we formed the Minority Cannabis Business Association to have a voice specifically of people of color to talk about this issue. And you can see our response actually on our website at minoritycannabis.org. Right at the top, there's a link to talk to exactly how we approach the issue with the police. And quite frankly, we made a statement in as support of the protesters as we could, and spent our platform and our voice supporting their efforts and making sure that as we continue this conversation of racial justice in every form and in every place that we can, that we do so powerfully and respectfully. And there are ways to do that. And so for me, as someone that, again, that's the first time I was arrested. I've been arrested many times by police. And, it's never been one where I felt anyone got safer afterwards. And I don't think most of the people in our communities would have any other thing to say about the police. And so it wasn't very surprising to me, but we were able to point to some very intense modern hypocrisies that are going on regarding the legal sale of cannabis, and there's still being folks in prison and still being arrested and assaulted based on whether or not they have cannabis. And so it was very clear to us that addressing criminal justice and how our society looks at how police and law enforcement are allowed to operate in our society is part and parcel and at the core of what we do. And it needs to be changed. It's clearly not working today, and it's historically, obviously, been racist in its both intent and its impact, both of those, right? And so we have been excited to see people broadening the conversation now and talking about defunding the police and taking other approaches to keeping our communities safe that aren't just bringing a person with a gun into a situation. And so just to be clear, like the purpose of police is to inject violence into a situation to achieve some desired goal, right? Like that's all they really are. They're a person that is allowed to exert violence onto a situation, and that's what they do to every single problem. And so for cannabis activists that are now allowed to operate in business while people are still in prison, this whole moment is a big ball of hypocrisy that's where I think, that tension has been stewing for a long time, and that was part of what's going on. We're seeing police and communities that are wealthier be able to live in a world that has a different legal framework than communities of color. And that sort of second class, caste system that we've had in the States for a long time is never going to be tenable in the long term. The oppressed will always fight to throw off their chains eventually. And I think we are in, the moment where folks have really just had enough and they're not willing to accept that we're just going to have another task force about this. And so we have to make sure that we keep that same passion and fire when we talk about cannabis policies, when we talk about climate change policies, because it's always going to come back to what are we willing to accept for our communities. And that's the fight we've been having all year in various ways, and it'll be the fight we continue to have. But it is a little bit different now. Surveillance is different now. There are different issues all around. But I'm excited to see that at least, in this moment, our people did rise up and say that, no, we need to change things.
Thanks so much for that.
Yeah, I think I want to share a little bit about how, what we've been doing in Sunrise throughout the past, throughout the uprising is, as more Black and Brown hub members have gotten involved, organizers, we've been advocating for, for these intersections for folks to see how does the Green New Deal, how can we make it more centered on racial justice, on equity. And we've been collaborating with the Movement for Black Lives to organize, even do trainings online, on how to defund the police so people can do that. So yeah, the climate justice is, directly related to racial justice as well. As far as here within our hub in DC, I want to give an example of how can we even go further beyond that, and how is it that we can also collaborate more on drug policy. So there's an initiative that was just passed, that was led by Decriminalize Nature DC, which is it received over 25,000 signatures, and it's to decriminalize the use of entheogenic plants here within the District of Columbia. And so this measure is now going to be voted on in November. And I've been wanting to have our hub build a partnership with them so that we can really center, folks who have been the most impacted by drug policies, right? Like by the war on drugs, especially to lead that initiative and educate folks on, the use of why do people use this? What are the benefits of it, especially the health and mental health benefits of it. So yeah, I think it's so important that we follow the leadership of Black, Indigenous, and people of color on these movements, because I think my concern is that what happened with the cannabis industry, right, is that's going to be replicated within now that entheogenic plants are being more mainstream, that they're starting to become decriminalized. It's which is white folks end up being the ones who predominantly end up getting permits to sell them, and then it's the folks who are Black and Brown folks are still in jail for while white folks are making a profit from those same substances. So I think there's a big opportunity for BIPOC folks to step in and lead right now, and now that a psychedelic renaissance is happening. So my desire is to build these partnerships here in DC to see how can we collaborate, so that people can see the intersections of climate justice, but also drug policy.
Absolutely, thank you. That's it's a really good example, and that's a really great work with your hub. Yeah. So we are somehow already coming up on time. That was really fast. From this point,
So we identified these problems as systemic and structural, and we need change. We need change as big as the problems that we face, right? And so, going up against the most powerful entities in the world takes a movement, right? And so, do you have any advice for people who want to play a part in the movement for racial justice, the movement to end the war on drugs and climate justice?
You want to go first on that one, Josh?
You go for it.
All right. I mean, that's a difficult one, and it kind of depends who the audience listening is, right? And so I have different advice for people of color and for white communities. And so to my people of color, I mean, the first thing I always tell folks is do not be naive about the powers that you are fighting against. A lot of folks want to go in and hope that change can be had relatively quickly, and that all we have to do is present better information and folks will change their mind. And that is simply not the case. Politics and power in general are much more complicated and sinister than that. But I do think once you start to have a fuller understanding about how power dynamics work in society, it will help you approach all the different issues and understand that at the root of it, a lot of it tends to be greed and money, and different folks are motivated by different things. But when it comes to this particular moment, we are talking about overthrowing systems of oppression that have been around for 1,000 years, if not more. And so we have to be realistic with ourselves and kind enough to our organizers to not expect overnight success. I think what is going to be super vital in the next moments, especially as things are shifting, is getting into a habit of training and retraining each other on skills continuously and forever, right? Like we can't necessarily rely on universities or other traditional schooling to give us those skill sets, but we do have new tools like YouTube and video conferencing that we can share things that have been learned in ways that weren't possible before. And so there are numerous resources out there. I always instruct folks to check out the Reimagining Change rulebook by the Center for Story-Based Strategy. It is a really important manual that tells folks exactly how to craft a grand narrative and how people think about things in society. And so resources like that, trainings of each other on how to run meetings, how to run chapters, how to do community organizing at the local, state, and federal level, those are things that as MCBA, we really focus on providing those tools to folks, especially through model policies. And again, that's another piece I'll just throw out there finally in wrapping up. We have to become confident and capable of writing our own laws. We cannot ask that those who oppress us come up with the rules and then we fight them later. We need to start saying, I don't even care what Exxon and Mobil want as far as their economic policy. Here's the bill that I want. Here's the Green New Deal written by Mr. Alvarez, right? This is what we're fighting for. And I think the climate justice movement of all movements has done a really good, job of laying that out. This is what we want. I think the drug policy movement can take a page out of their book. And then I also think that the drug policy movement has been pretty effective at changing policies, right? Like as we go, it's a bit of a mess of like how they are, but we have beaten big corporations. We have beaten things like the prison industry. And I think we can be doing the same thing in cooperation with the climate justice movement to beat big oil and bring renewable, to our urban centers. And so we're lucky enough that we have a tremendous network of talent. And I do think figuring out how we turn that talent into content, how we turn that talent into action, that's the big challenge before us at this moment.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, partnerships are so critical right now. And it's like we need a movement, and that requires multiple organizations and collaborating, seeing these intersections, because it's like, we're tackling these systems, as Jason said. And if not, if something doesn't exist, right, start it. It's like one thing that I'm trying to do here in DC also is start a Mi Gente, group, which so that we can collaborate and organize around like issues that Latinx folks here in DC care about. But then partner with Sunrise, partner with other folks, like I said, like decriminalize nature, because that's what's it's gonna require, cross class, cross race, just cross gender, like everything, very intersectional, but always like centered on the most people, on the people that are the most impacted, following their leadership.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you both so much for contributing to this panel. Thank you for building out this story, and you're appreciated. And thank you everybody who's watching. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for participating and joining us for this panel on the intersection of drug policy reform and climate justice. So to get us started with our Q&A for our panelists, how has climate racism been fed by the war on drugs?
Yeah, I really like this question because I think it goes to the root of what the problem is here, where as a society, we declared war on plants and like very specific plants. And it was a measure to disrupt communities based on their relationship with nature, different types of nature that they wanted to engage with. And so we're seeing both, racism is for people, but also this, discrimination against certain types of plants that justified destroying the planet for law and order, right? And I think as we start to see that ripple onto other things, like I think it was mentioned earlier, Plan Colombia, or just, dumping of different types of toxic waste, that our government, for whatever reason, thinks it's perfectly acceptable to wage war on our communities and our planets in order to produce money. And I think the core of both of these is the same. It's disrupting communities of color. It's making sure resources remain in the hands of the few. And it's the same people that are doing a lot of the damage in both areas, right? Like when you go and look at it, it's major multinational corporations that want to extract wealth from the planet. And so not only is it similar in how we are demonized, but it's the same folks doing the demonizing of us. And so we have a unified enemy here, and of course, a unified interest in making it stop, because both of our communities, all of these communities, are going to be affected. Not just the war on drugs as a policy, but destroying our planet. We can't necessarily fix that moving forward, and so it's something that, while some folks may disagree, if they permanently damage the planet, we're going to take some real serious science to have to heal that. And so, I just think that it's absurd in 2020, in this day and age, we still do things as barbaric as waging wars on plants.
Yeah, definitely. Jason framed it really well. It's a war on drugs, or it's a war on nature. And specifically, the way that indigenous communities, for example, have historically used plant medicines to heal their communities, to connect with spirits, right? For ceremony. So I think there's an extension of colonization is imposing these laws on these communities that have historically used these plants for healing purposes. So yeah, it's really a war on nature.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's a really great way to think about this. And so another question we have is, so we're talking about the intersection of these movements and how can the cannabis movement be a better ally to the climate justice movement?
I've seen a lot of interesting things in both movements, and there's different types of appeal to each. Drug use is a very personal thing, and so there's a different sort of entry point for a lot of folks that are working on drug policy, because they themselves are drug users, or they've had a negative interaction with the criminal justice system, so we're very policy focused. Like, we're very much about the laws and what our rights are, where climate change is a bit of an existential crisis, where we're not going to see it happen right in front of us. No one's going to arrest me on climate law, right? But we're going to see it slowly happen. So I think what the cannabis industry does well is focusing on specific policies to change specific laws and then being able to push those through, right? Like, we've seen 30 plus states change their cannabis laws, even as the federal government does nothing. And so we've been able to do that. We've been able to bring a lot of folks from various parts of society together, where the climate justice movement, though, has been better at urgency, at making the politicians and the people and the movements say, we need to fix this now, right? Like, cannabis policy has taken 50, 60, or 100 years, depending on how you want to look at it, where the Sunrise Movement and Extinction Rebellion, a lot of these organizations have made it that it is a crisis immediately that we really need to address. And so I think cannabis activists can definitely lend some sort of solution-oriented activism, as we do as far as what laws should be implemented and fighting for very specific incremental changes. Whereas we have a lot to learn from the climate justice movement of how to get our issue to the top of the agenda.
Yeah, definitely. I think at Sunrise, what we're advocating for is for the Green New Deal, right? It's that is our end goal. That is what we want. We need to achieve 100% renewable energy by 2030. That's what scientists are telling us in order to protect our planet. I think one way that we can see for example, how does the hemp industry overlap with the Green New Deal? There's ways that we can tie it in. I was like, hemp is such a sustainable product that can be used for so many things. And it's something that we can find ways of those overlaps more.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, and so another question we have is related to like the communities that are impacted by food deserts and over policing, and could either of y'all talk about like how those two things interact?
Yeah, I mean, so that one is about how cities and governments create zoning rules in a particular city or state and where they decide to allow resources to go. And so part of the problem with, I used to work for the city council of Hartford, Connecticut, that's where I'm from, Hartford. And, you know, there's only so much space in a small city to put various things, and to put businesses and to put residential neighborhoods. And so you'll see in many major cities, at least half of the land goes to social services. And so that land could be, you know, a school, it could be a hospital, it could be a lot of different things. At least half the land, you know, for everything else. And so that includes housing. So as you start to divide up the spaces, you'll see that churches take another huge amount of percentages of every urban center. So again, it shrinks the amount of land ever comes to space and producing revenue. They have to be very specific. Generally speaking, big supermarkets are very huge and won't want to be in a space that is very high rent for a very small space. And so as you go out to the suburbs, there's just that's what the city councils will tell you. It is definitely something that could be done. We're seeing farmers markets pop up more in these cities, but it's the same type of, we're going to tell this community that what they need is all these other things other than what the community says what they actually want, right? And so again, it's like solving problems by adding more police, right? The community can say, no, we don't need more police, we need more teachers in our school. And they're like, okay, well, we're going to put 100 more police in order to arrest everybody, right? And so the same thing, the community can say, we need a supermarket. And here in Arbor, we've been saying it for a long time, and it was actually supposed to be part of a big development, be part of that. Well, I can tell you the baseball stadium got built and the supermarket did not, and we did build a new police department. And so I think, you know, this is both situations where governments and government officials choose to use a punitive approach to solve problems and punish people for not doing what they want them to do, rather than giving them the resources to be successful. And that sort of, you know, it just at the core of how municipal governments and state governments work, that we have to have a shift in priorities and how we solve problems. I think that's what the defund the police campaigns have gotten so much traction, is because people can see how much money goes to the police and see how much money goes to all these other things that are not food, that are not social services. And so I think, you know, we're starting to reevaluate any of our problems. But for the last 30 years, driven in part by the war on drugs, we thought we could solve every problem as if everything was a nail and using police to hammer everything down. And, you know, I think that was a mistake. Definitely, we're seeing the repercussions of that. But it's going to take a cultural shift that when we see problems in society, we can't punish our way out of them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think even investing in community gardens, for example, is such a crucial thing, because, you know, it's land is what feeds us, right? It's like land is where all these plants, you know, where wheat comes from. So it's like we need these spaces, and I think we're seeing right now like the importance of having them. It's like, right, you know, it's like people are in this pandemic, they're figuring out where to go, where to hang out at. I was like, that's why parks are really overcrowded. Like we need, instead of funding so many police, right, it's like invest in more community spaces, more community gardens, you know, places that provide free food, right? It's like for the people. But unfortunately, you know, this capitalistic system that we live under doesn't, you know, allow for that. So we need to reevaluate our priorities, like Jason said.
Play out with cannabis policy too, right? So like instead of having greenhouses and smaller farms and licensing lots of people to grow their cannabis in small scales, we're using these huge warehouses with electric lights, you know, that are using ridiculous amounts of electricity in a frozen place like Connecticut, rather than importing, you know, fantastic cannabis from California, right? And supporting the growers over there. So like our policies are clearly creating, you know, additional problems when it comes to climate change, clearly creating additional expenses for patients when it comes to the cannabis that they need. And it's all to produce profit, right? Like this is not a public policy based in science, reason, or compassion. right? And I think those are the three things we want our public policies to be based in, and instead it's greed and profit, right? And so anywhere in public policy that you see those sort of things happening, you're going to end up with negative results. And we're seeing it negative climate results and negative results when it comes to the cannabis industry.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Those are all really good points. Another question we have is asking about how if like what is there a role for federal regulation in like preventing the cannabis industry from being harmful to the environment?
Sure. And so, I'm actually going to cover this in the next panel right after this a bit. But I think so when we look back on federal regulation, definitely mixed results on that. And so I am, concerned that just having the feds come in and regulate it, they won't do it. However, one time where we did have to bring the feds in was the desegregation of our schools. And that is an example where we did have the federal government intervene because there was a clear interest as a country to heal this problem of Jim Crow and racism and segregation. And so the country said, no, as a country, there's going to be a bare minimum standard that states have to abide by for all of us to have a stronger country, right? And so we can do that with equity programs. We can say the federal government will say, you can design your licensing structures how you think makes the most sense, but at minimum, there needs to be a 1-to-1 ratio of licenses from equity to traditional licenses. Or we can do it in regards to our criminal justice system. The federal government can say, any state that moves forward with a regulatory framework must release anyone in prison that is in prison for a law that is now legal. Right? The federal government can tell the states, and they can do it through the power of the purse by withholding funds for different things. But there's lots of other ways through legislation. There's a lot of ways they can do that. And then lastly, community investment. Like the federal government can ensure that tax revenue goes to the communities most effective. There's a number of ways that can do that. We already do things like community economic development grants that go out every single 2 years to various cities, to all the cities in the country, actually. And then those communities decide where those monies go. And so the federal government does have a role to play in setting the standard for all the different states to make sure there's a bare minimum of interest in equity across the board. Secondly, they can standardize what it means to be an equity applicant or what it means to be a minority-owned business in cannabis or various types of certifications and qualifications. The federal government can say, all states should honor these designations, similar to how we might do organic labeling or other types of ways show a product was made by focusing on sustainable suppliers and free trade and fair trade. That's what I'm looking at, fair trade agreements. The federal government can regulate that part of it while still allowing the states to implement the programs that they want.
Do you have anything you'd like to add, Josh? Okay. Okay, time. So I guess just to create some space, if either of y'all have any closing thoughts that you'd like to.
I mean, real quickly, just that these issues are directly linked, and I would like to see way more actions together where we're talking together with one voice on this. Obviously, you're right on the hemp, right? There's just tremendous environmental things that we can do together on that, rebuilding how we build society. But really, we just got to start going out there and connecting. This is a war on nature. We're trying to protect our planet for our future generations, and I think that's where we all agree.
Yeah, definitely. And I also think we need to center the most impacted voices, right? It's like we need to hear from Black and brown people, who have been criminalized for using these substances, but also prioritize them, right? It's like give them priority over now that these things are becoming legalized. But I also think is like we need to build those partnerships, right? It's like Jason said, like these are all connected, all these issues. So it's like we need to figure out how can we, for example, like incorporate drug policy into the Green New Deal.
Okay, and with that, that is the end of our Q&A. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us, and stick around for our panel on social equity. Okay.
The cannabis industry in the U.S. supplies over 3 million medical patients with a safe alternative to prescription drugs, generates over $1.9 billion in tax revenue, and employs an estimated 300,000 people. There is no legal cannabis industry without strong advocates. Even though over 70% of Americans favor legalization, cannabis remains federally prohibited, and the sale and production of cannabis in legal states largely depend on local government regulations. More reform is needed to ensure everyone can access this incredible plant and to help the burgeoning cannabis industry continue to grow. If you want to be able to benefit from cannabis, whether it be starting your own business, growing your own medicine, or expanding access in your community, you need to be able to explain the benefits of cannabis to others. To empower cannabis advocates across the country, Green Flower has partnered with the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Law to create the Cannabis Advocacy Certificate Program. The program will arm you with the expertise to affect change in your area, your state, or even at a national level. The Cannabis Advocacy Certificate Program is available 100% online. Enroll today and start learning instantly. Green Flower programs are trusted by universities, top brands, respected organizations, and thousands of alumni. NORML has been influencing policy reforms and framing the conversation around cannabis in the U.S. for over 50 years. There is no better team to help you learn how to become a more effective advocate. Upon completion of the program, you will receive your Green Flower Academy Cannabis Advocacy Certificate as an acknowledgement of your accomplishment and your expertise. This first-of-its-kind training program is led by NORML Deputy Director Paul Armentano, Texas NORML Executive Director Jack Svinkel, and NORML's Development Director Jen Michelle Padini. Each will share the insights and strategies they've used to shape cannabis policy around the country. You'll learn about nonprofit operations and management, building strategic alliances, bolstering voter engagement and community involvement, framing your message and working with the media, partnering with government officials, implementing initiatives, ways to defend progress. You'll also learn about the history of cannabis advocacy and why advocacy matters. Visit green-flower.com/advocacy to enroll in the Cannabis Advocacy Certificate Program today.
Greetings everyone and happy Saturday. My name is Queen Adesumi and I'm a policy manager with the Drug Policy Alliance's National Affairs Office in Washington, D.C. I'm here filming in Fort Totten in D.C. and I hope this message meets you and yours as safe and well as possible in these really dark and really uncertain times. It's absolutely a pleasure of mine to be able to introduce our next speaker, Senator Ron Wyden. Senator Wyden has been a long-time champion for reforms to the criminal legal system and has been, over the years, a great supporter for marijuana reform in Congress, introducing his own pieces of legislation to delist marijuana, as well as being a supporter of the MORE Act, Marijuana Opportunity, Reinvestment, and Expungement Act, which is currently the most comprehensive marijuana justice reform bill in Congress to date. I'm really excited to hear his remarks, and with that, I'm going to pass it off to Senator Ron Wyden.
Hello, folks. Ron Wyden, one of Oregon's United States Senators. And I'm very proud that our state was one of the first to legalize marijuana. And what we saw is that this is an issue of social justice, it's an issue of public health, it's an issue of economics, and first and foremost, it's a matter of common sense. These policies literally are from yesteryear, and they haven't kept up with the times. And that is why so many states are following in Oregon's footsteps and legalizing. So it is just a matter of time until our cause goes national. And I want you to know, as the senior Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee that has authority on tax issues, we're going to be working closely with you every step of the way.
Hi, my name is Amber Littlejohn with the Minority Cannabis Business Association. Today I'll be sitting down with Deshita Dawson, Dr. Rachel Knox, Kurshit Koja, and Jason Ortiz as we discuss equity and federal cannabis regulation. Although regulations aren't the first thing most people think about when it comes to cannabis policy, regulations impact everything from product safety to barriers to entry and sustainability for small minority-owned businesses. We hope you enjoy our discussion, and please stay tuned for the live Q&A. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Amber Littlejohn from the Minority Cannabis Business Association. Cannabis policy significantly impacts the physical, mental, and economic health of the communities most impacted by cannabis prohibition and the broader war on drugs. So to ensure the health of our community, equity must be the cornerstone of any legal cannabis framework. Not an afterthought, but woven throughout cannabis policy. This administrative and regulatory policies that ensure the safety and well-being of our community, access to medicine, and appropriate regulatory burdens that don't create undue barriers that keep the communities of color from participating in the legal cannabis market. With each new presidential administration come new policies, new regulations, and new regulators. So with that, we want to take a look at not only the underlying policy issues, but at the policymakers themselves. So now with that, I will turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. Khurshid?
Hi, everyone. My name is Khurshid Koja. I am an attorney by trade, and I have been working in the cannabis industry since 2011. I currently sit on the board of the Minority Cannabis Business Association and co-chair its policy committee, and also chair the board of the National Cannabis Industry Association and sit on their federal policy council as well.
Dr. Knox?
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Rachel Knox. I'm a family and integrative medicine by training, but these days practice endocannabinology and cannabinoid medicine. I'm a founding board member of the Minority Cannabis Business Association. I also serve the board of Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, and I'm the current chair of the Oregon Cannabis Commission.
Fantastic. Thank you for being here. Ms. Dawson.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dashita Dawson, and I am the City of Portland's Cannabis Program Supervisor. I also serve on the Governance Frameworking Subcommittee for the Oregon Cannabis Commission, and I'm also on the board for Doctors for Cannabis Regulation. Excited to be here.
Fantastic. And last but not least, our fearless leader at MCBA.
So my name is Jason Ortiz. I'm the president of the Minority Cannabis Business Association. I'm also on the board for Students for Sensible Drug Policy and the National Puerto Rican Agenda. And I got started in cannabis when I was arrested in high school, so I've definitely been in the impacted community side of things. But now I'm actually a political consultant for Democratic campaigns. And so I'm looking forward to having a conversation around how this plays out in November and what it means for 2020.
Federally prohibited some cannabis was political and racial. Makers want to talk about cannabis policy. They are saying that federal cannabis descheduling needs to be a look at the broader health and safety implications of not just cannabis, but prohibition itself. I want to turn it over to Dr. Knox. Dr. Knox, what kind of an impact does cannabis prohibition have on the physical?
Super loaded as well. And it's twofold. At least I can make it twofold. And first and foremost, the prohibition of is that harmful or didn't pose the prohibition of scientific research, right? So prohibition in effect has withheld what could be potentially have been effective medicine for reduce the burden of inflammation in these disease processes. And this includes chronic heart disease, cancer, chronic complications of type 2 diabetes, which are amongst our top 5 leading causes of morbidity and mortality in our country. And when we apply that to communities of color, and specifically the Black community, our folks are suffering from those very same diseases at disproportionately higher rates. So again, prohibition has withheld scientific and medical advancement around the potential of cannabis to treat certain conditions. And then secondly, prohibition, right, by way of enforcing marijuana laws, where we saw the over-enforcement and disproportionate enforcement in communities of color, has led to chronic stress, and diseases that stem from that, chronic anxiety, chronic depression, PTSD. Our communities are the most underdiagnosed, yet we have statistics that suggest PTSD is disproportionately higher in our Black communities. Add that to the compound effect of marginalization and disinvestment in our communities of color. Now we can draw a line directly from cannabis prohibition to the poor state of community health and individual health within our communities.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Knox. Always insightful. So that gets us to the process of descheduling. So do we deschedule, do we reschedule, or is it something else? We know that we've heard from the Biden camp that they prefer a rescheduling approach. But definitely some of the calls from industry have not supported that type of an approach. So Khurshid, is it descheduling, rescheduling, or is it some other kind of a hybrid?
It's from my perspective, and I think I'm probably speaking for our group here. It's definitely descheduling. Yes, there's absolutely a place for cannabinoid medicine, and I'd like to see cannabinoid medicine flourish. But that doesn't mean that we need to have a monopoly of the pharmaceutical companies on cannabinoid research and cannabinoid medicine. Add to that the fact that people aren't going to stop smoking cannabis. People are not going to stop consuming cannabis the way that they have traditionally done. And so rescheduling as opposed to descheduling does not solve that issue. You still have the basis in place for criminal prohibition of entire communities that consume cannabis based on the rescheduling model, right? So descheduling is really the only effective way for us to both address that issue, prohibition and its impacts on communities of color, over policing, and also give industry the berth that it needs to develop and continue to develop the industry, jobs, tax base, et cetera, everything that the cannabis industry brings with it. So definitely descheduling is the way we would like to see this go as opposed to rescheduling. But there is a place for cannabinoid medicine, and thankfully we have amazing doctors like Dr. Knox to help lead the way on that. So.
Ms. Dawson, so how, for you as a local level regulator of cannabis, how does federal prohibition impact your work and your ability to implement programs at the local level?
Well, that's a great question, Amber. And I also want to just say that I piggyback everything that Dr. Knox just said. And Khurshid, we don't want it to be rescheduled. We need it to be descheduled. The current state prevents us from moving as freely as one would like. We are definitely tied to ensuring that we're upholding sort of the protection of the Cole memo. But every time we go in front of City Council to provide funds back to the community, we actually have stated for the record, the city attorney saying, hey, by the way, this is still federally illegal. And by even giving out these funds in this way, technically we may be breaking a federal law. Now, that being said, last year, the federal government collected $1.4 billion from states from cannabis tax revenue. So, I find it difficult that my $600,000 that I just gave in a social equity grant fund should put me at that much risk, but that is something that is always at the backdrop, particularly in Portland. I was actually surprised by it, given it's one of the more mature markets, but because it is mature, it has gone through the early years where the federal government pre-Cole memo time did actually interfere with state processes. And just to reiterate, that even when we have a legal state, it is still Black and Indigenous populations that are primarily targeted. So when we have federal raids on state licensed businesses, those have still been primarily Black and Indigenous and people of color owned businesses across California, Washington, as well as in Oregon. So for now, in the last few years, I would say federal prohibition has been not too big of a risk. And the more money that the federal government takes from state legalization, I feel it becomes even less. What I worry about now is federal legalization not accounting for all that we've learned, because so many jurisdictions have already done this wrong and are working to backtrack. And my concern is that our lawmakers at the federal level are still pretty ignorant to all that we now know around cannabis science, but also some of the fear-based laws and bro science-based laws that we implemented and the regulatory missteps. that slowed down the process. And I think rescheduling versus descheduling is one of those potential missteps where we essentially still block out the core of the cannabis community, the advocacy-based community that have transitioned into entrepreneurs, the small businesses, in lieu of a much larger pharmaceutical structure.
And I just want to jump in here real quick and make a distinction between cannabinoid-based drugs that pharmaceutical companies would be making, right, that would have to pass through prescriptions by doctors, et cetera, and medicinal cannabis, right? So medicinal cannabis is what's legal in medical states and adult use states. This is medicinal just means has a potential therapeutic effect or a therapeutic effect. And so for us, descheduling is important because we believe people should have access to natural medicinal therapy options that absolutely can and should mirror what the pharmaceutical companies and even biopharmaceutical companies like GW might produce and put out in the marketplace as well. So, we can have a competitive marketplace between the world of cannabis and big pharma, and we should. And at the end of the day, people should have, agency over their decision to choose medicinal cannabis or to pursue cannabinoid-based drug therapies that they would get clinically. And also to that note, in the hospital setting, absolutely, there is a place for cannabinoid drug therapies. There's a lot of purists out here who think that medicinal cannabis should be the end all and be all. And again, there's a place for all of it.
So Jason, what position does that leave a candidate who supports, or what position should that leave a candidate that supports a rescheduling approach as a member of both the entrepreneur and the activist segments of our beautiful biosphere that we have here in cannabis? What do you think? What are the consequences of that?
I think it leaves a lot of room for them to grow as they get along the campaign trail to match what their constituents want. I mean, I think if we look at the DNC platform, that itself was already more progressive than Joe Biden's personal policy. But even, under Trump, which is another, element of this, we had our first policy summit